Chapter 3053. The moment she saw this essence, the middle-aged woman knew that her essence had changed in a way that she did not want to see. The source of this feeling was none other than the fact that she could only rely on her familiarity with the essence to confirm that this mountain range was formed from her essence. Apart from that, there was no other connection between her and this essence. Such a situation would never have happened if she was in her normal state. "What did you do to my essence?" At this moment, the middle-aged woman immediately pointed to Luo Fan, the master of the 365 levels of the world. Hearing this, Luo Fan smiled faintly and said, "What did I do?" No, I didn't do anything. Everything that has happened to you is a result of the change in your nature." As he spoke, Luo Fan pointed at the mountain range ahead. A space portal appeared in front of them out of thin air. Through this space portal, one could see a vast and boundless universe. In the starry sky of the universe, there were countless stars. This was the scene inside the essence. Although they were stars, the middle-aged woman could sense that every single one of them was very familiar. It was as if they were a part of her, just that they were presented in a different form. It has its own will. Then, as the source of this essence, she immediately discovered the abnormality of this essence. After discovering this, she felt that her worldview was almost overturned. This was her essence, which was an invisible and intangible existence. Normally speaking, it was already incredible for it to transform into this specific form, but actually gave birth to a will similar to the will of heaven and earth. This was simply challenging all the knowledge that she had accumulated in the past hundreds of millions of years. At this time, Luo Fan only smiled faintly at the middle-aged woman's incarnation, but he did not respond to her exclamation. Now, he was more interested in the interaction between the abnormal will of the essence and the middle-aged woman. One was the master of the essence, while the other was a brand new abnormal will born from the essence. He was extremely curious about what would happen between the two. At this moment, the incarnation that belonged to Luo Fan and the essence flashed slightly and disappeared without a trace, directly fusing with the incarnation standing outside the space portal. All the means that he had used against the abnormal will disappeared completely at this moment, allowing the abnormal will to regain its freedom. At this moment, the abnormal will did not return to the residence of the abnormal will. Instead, it gathered its perception and probed the space portal. More specifically, it probed the middle-aged woman's incarnation outside the space portal. At this moment, the middle-aged woman's body emitted a powerful aura that fiercely collided with the abnormal will's perception. With this collision, the void collapsed, and the space portal that was originally not too big collapsed in an instant. However, the collapse of the space portal did not completely cut off the connection between the space-time inside the essence and the outside world. On the contrary, with the collapse of the spatial portal, the space-time inside and outside was completely connected. The connection that was originally limited to within the portal was directly expanded to more than 1,000 times its original size. The relationship between space-time and space was extremely mysterious. Space-time included time and space. In other words, a piece of space-time had its own independent space and independent time. Perhaps this kind of time and space were extremely similar to other times and spaces, and they even behaved almost the same. However, this did not change the fact that the time and space between different space-time were independent. Generally, it was not too complicated to establish a connection between space-time of the same nature. It could even be said that it was as easy as connecting two buildings together. However, this was only because the nature of the space-time was similar, which greatly simplified the entire communication process. It did not mean that the communication between space-time was that simple. In fact, if any two independent space-time wanted to communicate with each other, to establish a connection, to establish a spatial passage between them, and to establish a spatial connection, the subtle changes and complexity involved would definitely exceed the limits of the imagination of most living beings. First of all, One had to harmonize the space so that the originally independent space-time could harmonize and resonate with each other. Only then would the first step be completed. After that, one had to harmonize time. Even if the space-time harmonized and resonated with each other, if the time was still independent and had no connection with each other, it would only be equivalent to two parallel space-times. Obviously, if that was all, the two space-times were obviously not enough to establish a real connection. It was precisely because of this that harmonizing time was so important. Even if the space-time harmonized, it was still not the last step to connect the two space-times. If it was only this step, the two space-times might be able to sense and see each other, but it would still be impossible for the matter and living beings in them to interact with each other. This was because different space-times had different rules and regulations. If these rules and regulations could naturally communicate with each other, it would naturally avoid the following troubles. However, it was obvious that the rules and regulations of different space-times could naturally communicate with each other. It was just a special situation. If it was a conversation that was universal, the rules and regulations of different space-times would obviously not be able to communicate with each other naturally. Under such circumstances, it was obvious that the rules and regulations of both space-times had to be adjusted to be able to allow the rules and regulations of both sides to communicate with each other. Apart from that, there were also countless troublesome differences that arose because of this. These differences needed to be addressed one by one in order to truly connect the two space-times together. However, although the process of connecting different space-times was like that, generally speaking, connecting spacetimes would not really change the spacetime completely. After all, it was only to connect spacetimes and not to completely homogenize the two spacetimes. Generally speaking, connecting spacetimes was actually just to build a moderate area between the two spacetimes and become a bridge between the two spacetimes, allowing one to harmonize the time, space, rules, and everything else in the two spacetimes at the same time. The process of change was much more complicated than completely changing one side. In other words, in fact, the process of Luo Fan opening the spatial door to a certain space seemed to be casual, but it actually contained a huge amount of subtle changes. The reason why it seemed casual and relaxed was because Luo Fan's means were too brilliant and his strength was too shocking. The method needed to connect different spacetimes clearly showed that the different nature of spacetimes did not have any intrinsic impact on this kind of communication. The entire process of communication was the same, but the greater the difference between the spacetimes, the greater the adjustment needed. In other words, even if the spacetime within the essence was illusory or even void, it was just a metaphysical spacetime. However, if one wanted to connect that space-time with this world, the process of communication was no different from the normal space-time. Naturally, although there was no difference in essence, the difficulty was naturally completely different. If it was an ordinary cultivator, it would be almost impossible to connect such a space-time with this world. The reason why this kind of communication seemed so smooth and easy at this time was only because the existence that established this kind of communication was extremely extraordinary. After all, what kind of existence could make the connection between the space-time and this world expand to such an extent? One of them was a seventh tribulation powerhouse. Although she was only using her incarnation to display her power, a seventh tribulation powerhouse was still a seventh tribulation powerhouse. Even if she was using her incarnation to display her power, her means were definitely not what any sixth tribulation powerhouse could compare to. What was the other existence? The other party that truly established the connection between the space-time and this world was the abnormal will that was equivalent to the will of the world. As an existence that was similar to the will of the world, its own level was almost equivalent to the level of the world it was in. What was the world? The world was the essence of the seventh tribulation powerhouse. In this way, it could be considered as an existence that contained all the secrets of the seventh tribulation powerhouse and all the mysteries of cultivation. Its level was naturally equivalent to the level of the seventh tribulation powerhouse. Obviously, since the world was at such a level, the level of the abnormal will was also the same. It was also at the level of the seventh tribulation powerhouse. For existences of this level, it was already an almost instinctive behavior to connect different spacetimes, spacetime and the world, and even different worlds and different heavens and earth. As a result, they were able to expand the spatial door to this extent without even realizing it, allowing the world to truly connect with the world. At this time, the middle-aged woman manipulated her incarnation to directly face the abnormal will. Her eyes were like searchlights that directly penetrated the endless distance and saw the body of the abnormal will. At this time, the abnormal will also directly saw the incarnation of the middle-aged woman. Its perception seemed to penetrate everything, directly penetrating the barrier of the incarnation and seeing the existence behind the incarnation. It was the owner of the incarnation, the seventh tribulation powerhouse, in the appearance of the middle-aged woman. Both of them could see themselves in each other. They could see themselves in another possibility. At this moment, an inexplicable hostility was born in both of their hearts at the same time. For the seventh tribulation powerhouse, the emergence of such an abnormal will in her essence meant that her essence had already betrayed her. It meant that there was an enemy who was extremely familiar with her on the road to becoming a Tao master, but who might have a strong hostility towards her. For the abnormal will, the existence of the seventh tribulation powerhouse was equivalent to an enemy who originally controlled everything about her and would never be willing to let her leave and regain her freedom. Facing each other like this, it was obvious what kind of attitude they would have. "Let me see what it is that made you appear," said the seventh tribulation powerhouse in the appearance of the middle-aged woman. Suddenly, there was a flash of light and shadow on her body, turning into countless silk threads that gushed out wildly. They made a turn in the void and directly inserted into the space connection between the metaphysical space-time inside the essence and this world. They quickly poured into the space-time inside the essence, and in the blink of an eye, they covered the entire space-time, or rather, the entire universe, so that the entire universe seemed to be shrouded in a faint golden haze. After all, the seventh tribulation powerhouse was the owner of the essence, even if the essence had already given birth to its own abnormal will and completely cut off the connection between it and her. But her degree of familiarity with the essence was still far from what ordinary existences could compare with. At this time, she directly targeted the flaw in the essence and easily transmitted her power to the entire universe inside the essence, covering it completely in an instant. Of course, the birth of the abnormal will was obviously not within the scope of her knowledge. Therefore, the strange space-time where the abnormal will's main body was located and the extremely special island that should have been the focus of her investigation was not shrouded by even more light fog. Although it was not that there was no light fog covering the space-time and the abnormal will's main body, that was more of a side effect of the seven tribulation powerhouse's familiarity with the essence and covering the entire universe with her power. In other words, because the abnormal will's main body and the space-time belonged to this universe, it was covered by the light fog. In other words, the light fog was only treating it like a normal thing that existed in this universe. This kind of power was enough to completely study the void, but it was obviously a fool's dream to want to understand the essence of the abnormal will. Therefore, although the light fog had already covered the entire universe, the seventh tribulation powerhouse was still confused about the root cause of the abnormal will's birth. She couldn't even see through how the abnormal will controlled the entire universe. At this moment, the abnormal will clearly reacted. It didn't move at all, but in the blink of an eye, a vortex gradually began to appear in the boundary between the universe and the outside world, gradually covering the entire boundary. Chapter 3054. This vortex was obviously formed by the abnormal will. Its essence was similar to the vortex formed by the will of the world. The vortex looked like a huge eye, and the center of the vortex was the eyeball of the eye. At this moment, the middle-aged woman felt like she was being stared at by a huge eye. Along with this change, The middle-aged woman felt that her perception of the starry sky inside the vortex had started to weaken substantially. The middle-aged woman furrowed her brows slightly. The scene before her meant that the abnormal will's control over the starry sky inside the vortex was far beyond her imagination. That was the only way such a situation could occur. At this moment, although her perception of the starry sky inside the vortex had weakened substantially, it had not been completely cut off. Therefore, during this process, she could clearly feel that the golden mist covering the entire starry sky was being cut off at an extremely fast speed. In just a short while, the density of the mist covering the starry sky had decreased by more than half. This was still not the end. After that, her mist of light continued to weaken at an even faster rate. As the mist weakened, her perception of the starry sky became more and more blurry. Seeing this, the middle-aged woman naturally could not just sit back and do nothing. At this moment, her figure swayed, and she directly crashed into the vortex. The vortex could be said to be the manifestation of the abnormal will. At this moment, when the middle-aged woman crashed into it, it was as if she had directly crashed into the body of the abnormal will. The degree of danger was self-evident. It could be said that at this moment, she had already opened up all her weaknesses to the abnormal will. At this moment, the vortex produced endless fluctuations, and an unknown amount of indescribable power was released from it, directly drowning the middle-aged woman. Facing such an attack, the middle-aged woman's expression did not change. Although these fluctuations in power were used on the parts that made her feel the most uncomfortable, they were produced in the most painful way. In that instant, he felt as if his body, his strength, his might, and everything else were under incredible pressure at this moment. However, she had already predicted all of this before she fell into this whirlpool. Therefore, she naturally wouldn't be moved by this at this moment. At this moment, she simply released her will and began to interact with the vortex around her in an indescribable way. Under that effect, the surrounding vortexes faintly produced some indescribable chaos. This chaos was rather weak, to the point that if one did not observe it carefully, they would completely ignore it. However, it was obvious that even such a weak chaos was extremely obvious to the abnormal willpower. After all, at this very moment, she was fighting against the original owner of this essence. If he dared not to be careful in the process of fighting, what kind of battle would he need to be careful in? As such, at this moment, the abnormal will instantly gathered its will towards the chaotic areas, using its powerful will to suppress the chaos. It wanted to sort out the chaos and turn it back into order so that it could regain absolute control over it. However, just like how the abnormal will knew the owner of this essence very well, Lin Yun was not a match for the owner of this essence. As the master of the essence, the middle-aged woman also had a deep understanding of the abnormal will that was born from the essence. At this moment, she had already considered what the abnormal will's focus was, what actions it would take in the future, and what choices it would make. Therefore, at this moment, the chaos was not only not wiped away by the abnormal will's will. On the contrary, it was like a living creature, constantly swimming in the vortex in an unimaginable way, continuously absorbing more of the vortex's main body and continuously growing. The entire process was like a small fish shuttling nimbly in the vortex, constantly devouring some kind of nutrients in the surroundings to grow. During this process, the abnormal will felt that there seemed to be some thoughts that did not belong to it in its heart. These thoughts were incomparably compatible with his own will and were almost no different from his own naturally generated thoughts. In fact, compared to the thoughts that it usually produced, it seemed more like it was produced by its own will. On the contrary, its usual thoughts seemed to be some kind of additional external thoughts. These thoughts told it that it was not the real her now. Right now, it was just a consciousness in a dream, a self that was distorted by the illusion of a dream. She needed to wake up from her dream in order to obtain her true self and truly break free from the influence of the distorted illusion. These thoughts continued to grow as the chaos in the vortex continued to expand. She felt that it was just a small, faintly discernible distracting thought at first, but as time passed, this distracting thought gradually occupied her attention, gradually suppressing the other more and more thoughts, taking up more and more weight in her heart. Sensing such changes, the abnormal will naturally could not sit back and do nothing. At this moment, a clear light swept through the vortex. The chaotic area was instantly covered by the clear light and began to gradually separate from the chaotic vortex in the surroundings. After all, this was the vortex that the abnormal will had manifested. Naturally, she did not think of anyone else who had the ability to control this vortex. Therefore, soon, the chaotic area was completely separated from the other chaotic areas in the surroundings. As the chaos was separated by the clear light, the abnormal will felt that the thoughts that made it doubt whether its existence was real were also separated. Although those thoughts were still popping up in his mind, they were no longer able to disturb him. If it was understood in a way that ordinary people could understand, those thoughts before were like someone experiencing something in the real world. However, the current situation was that this person saw the development of something through watching a movie. Obviously, the influence of experiencing something in the real world was far greater than watching a movie. Therefore, at this moment, the influence of those thoughts on her almost completely disappeared. Of course, the middle-aged woman would not give up just like that. The current situation was not beyond her expectations. Before entering the vortex, she had already expected this and had already made all sorts of preparations to deal with such a situation. It was precisely because of this that she rushed into this vortex without hesitation and faced the abnormal will's main body. At this moment, facing the chaotic clear light around her, layers of dimensions suddenly unfolded from the middle-aged woman's body. In the blink of an eye, the clear light began to split into countless attributes and was absorbed into those dimensions. Generally speaking, only 7 tribulation powerhouses had this kind of method of splitting dimensions. If it was a 6th tribulation powerhouse, facing such a method of splitting dimensions, they would definitely lose all ability to resist and be easily split into countless attributes. Obviously, this abnormal was not a 6th tribulation powerhouse. Actually, she could be considered another middle-aged woman. Based on what the middle-aged woman felt, she could actually be considered another possibility of the middle-aged woman. Under such circumstances as a 7th tribulation powerhouse, the middle-aged woman naturally also had the abnormal will. Although she was far from being as brilliant as Luo Fan in this kind of method of splitting dimensions, she could even use the power of many levels to split dimensions. However, it was not difficult for her to match up to the middle-aged woman. Therefore, at this moment, when the dimensions split the clear light into countless attributes and absorbed them into the countless dimensions, there were also many dimensions that appeared on the clear light. These dimensions intertwined with the dimensions released by the middle-aged woman and instantly canceled out the effects of the dimensional splitting. Although the dimensional splitting was called dimensional splitting, it was actually far more than just splitting. If it was just division, then wouldn't the existence who used this method also suffer the same division and be divided into countless attributes and be absorbed into the countless dimensions? If that was the case, then what was the difference between splitting a complete battlefield and turning it into countless battlefields? Therefore, this dimensional splitting definitely had the magical effect of protecting one's body from being affected by the dimensional splitting. Only such a magical effect could allow this dimensional splitting to be used in battle. At this moment, the abnormal willpower was clearly using this method to protect itself from being affected by the dimensional splitting method. Of course, protecting itself from being affected by the dimensional splitting was not just to protect itself from being affected by the dimensional splitting. This kind of protection was definitely omnidirectional. No matter what form it took, any dimensional splitting that was cast by any existence would definitely be able to protect itself. If there are two completely unfamiliar existences, the dimensional splitting that was cast by two completely different people naturally would not be able to cancel out each other so easily and form a true balance between them. However, it was clear that the middle-aged woman and the abnormal were not completely unfamiliar existences. Their familiarity with each other far exceeded the familiarity between any two people. After all, when they looked at each other, it was as if they were looking at another version of themselves. Therefore, they were able to easily grasp the number and strength of the dimensional splitting and achieve the ability to cancel out each other's dimensional splitting. Of course, no matter which party it was, they clearly did not want their dimensional splitting to only be able to cancel out the other party's dimensional splitting. Both of them were extremely eager to not only suppress the other party's dimensional splitting, but they also wanted to go a step further and divide the other party into countless attributes, and then completely eliminate the other party. Therefore, after canceling out each other's dimensional splitting, they did not stop there. Instead, they continued to push their dimensional splitting, wanted to overcome the other party's resistance, and completely divide the other party. However, it was clear that both of them had similar thoughts. Therefore, at this moment, although their dimensional division technique would occasionally overlap, and there would be times when one side would suppress the other side would not be able to suppress the other side. But most of the time, they were in a state of balance, and neither could suppress the other. Of course, although they were in a state of balance, it did not mean that their battle was dull and monotonous. In fact, although they were in a state of balance in the end, it was precisely because of this balance that their dimensional splitting was so intense and exciting that it was indescribable. It could be said that during their battle, billions of strange and wonderful ideas appeared in their minds at every moment. Their attacks were like surging tides, and it would not be an exaggeration to say that they covered the sky and covered the earth. Just by looking at the number of dimensions they split up, one could see how intense their battle was in the process. It must be known that the dimensional splitting that they carried out at the beginning only covered hundreds of thousands of dimensions. But as time went by, and as they clashed again and again, the number of dimensions they had divided had already reached tens of billions of dimensions. Dividing tens of billions of dimensions had a great impact on the boundary between this world and the internal universe, and it had reached an unimaginable level. At this moment, the border area had already become extremely chaotic. If it were not for the manifestation vortex of the abnormal willpower that was still there, replacing the various special features of the boundary, perhaps the connection between the universe and this world would have been completely severed. If it really came to that, the battle between the two of them might be able to pause for a while. Of course, such an outcome was clearly unacceptable to both parties. The middle-aged woman was extremely repulsed by the abnormal willpower that was destined to be her enemy, and before she destroyed it, she would not let go no matter what. As for the abnormal willpower, how could she be willing to let go of an enemy that would never give up on dealing with her, and was determined to destroy her? Even if they were to temporarily let go, it was absolutely unacceptable for both of them. Therefore, even though the abnormal willpower knew that it was it that maintained the communication between the two worlds and maintained the existence of this battlefield, it had no intention of letting go. Chapter 3055. When the middle-aged woman and the abnormal began to fight, Luo Fan had been watching from the side. Whether it was the middle-aged woman or the abnormal both of them were well aware of his existence. However, it was obvious that they did not have the ability and did not feel the need to care about Luo Fan. Needless to say, Luo Fan's strength had been vividly displayed when they fought against each other. Both the unusual consciousness and the middle-aged woman had suffered a great loss at his hands. They were only able to survive because of Luo Fan's will. Therefore, in terms of ability, it was obvious that they did not have the right to care about Luo Fan or change Luo Fan. Needless to say, in terms of necessity, at this moment, the outcome of the battle between the two of them had yet to be revealed, and they were clearly still useful to Luo Fan. Under such circumstances, they clearly did not need to worry about Luo Fan attacking them and changing the situation between them. Under such circumstances, they naturally did not need to worry about Luo Fan at all. At the very least, there was no need to worry about Luo Fan for the time being. At this moment, Most of the power of the 365 levels had gathered in this level, and the other 364 levels had become extremely fragile. As a result of this change, the island seemed to have turned into a bright moon. It hung in this level of the ocean of nothingness and shone brightly. The process was like using a magnifying glass to gather sunlight into a single point, which would greatly enhance the brightness of that point. Sunlight shone down. Although it was bright, it was not much different from other places. Looking from afar, it was absolutely difficult to distinguish this area from other areas just by looking at the light. However, if a magnifying glass appeared in this area and gathered all the sunlight into a single point, the situation would be completely different. In that case, the brightness of that point would far surpass other areas that were normally illuminated by sunlight. Naturally, it would become extremely eye-catching. From afar, one would definitely be able to see its existence at a glance. At this moment, the situation on this island was similar. Originally, although the power of the 365 layers on the island was not evenly distributed, it was still distributed among the 365 layers. This distribution was very similar to the distribution of power in the other areas of the void ocean layer. Under such circumstances, it was naturally not very conspicuous. At a glance, it would be easily confused with the other regions of the void ocean. At this moment, the many powers in the other 364 layers of the island were gathered into another layer, which was equivalent to gathering sunlight into a certain focal point. In this way, that world was naturally extremely eye-catching. In the eyes of all living beings, it was as conspicuous as a bright moon in the night sky. Under normal circumstances, such a bright moon would definitely attract the attention of numerous cultivators. It was even to the extent that it might cause this place to become like the projection of the world and become the center where numerous cultivators gathered. However, it was clear that under the current circumstances, being conspicuous was meaningless. After all, such an eye-catching sight was insignificant when compared to the numerous laws of heaven and earth silhouettes that existed in the layers of the sea of nothingness. How could such an insignificant bright moon attract any more cultivators? Therefore, at this moment, even though the island had turned into a bright moon, it was still calm and did not cause too much of a commotion. At this moment, on the island, where the middle-aged woman and her essence were, the battle had become increasingly intense. Countless levels of essence clashed. Not only did they collide, but they also constantly canceled each other out. During this process, there were also countless indescribable waves that continuously seeped out. Some of them were charging at the vortex that blocked the outside world from the starry sky of the inner universe, and some were charging out towards the outside world. In fact, the impact did not have a fixed direction. There is no difference in the impact of going inward or outward. In other words, under normal circumstances, the impact inward and outward should be equally powerful. The impact toward the outside world should be similar to the impact toward the starry sky of the inner universe. However, it was clear that the significance of the outside world and the starry sky of the inner universe was different for both sides of the battle. To the abnormal will, the starry sky within was its body, an inseparable part of it. If it was damaged, it would be equivalent to a part of its body being damaged. In this case, it naturally wanted to protect the inner universe as much as possible so that it would not be damaged. However, the situation was obviously different for the middle-aged woman. What did the outside world behind her have to do with her? If it had to be said that it had something to do with the outside world, it was the outside world that was restraining her and preventing her from transcending. In this case, how could she possibly care about any damage to the outside world? She did not take advantage of the situation to attack the outside world or destroy the outside world. This was already the result of her not having any strength left. Therefore, at this moment, she completely ignored the impact toward the outside world. She allowed the impact to continuously spread to the outside world and cause more and more serious damage to the outside world. Time and space collapsed, laws and laws collapsed, heaven and earth reversed, life was dying, karma was in chaos, and so on and so forth. A lot of imaginable and unimaginable chaos appeared in the outside world. Because of such changes, this layer of the world seemed to have fallen into the end of the world. It looked completely different from before. Looking at such a world, Luo Fan, who had seen everything in his eyes, did not show any abnormal behavior because of this. He did not even intervene to offset the impact and eliminate the chaos in this world. Instead, he simply watched the world fall toward its final collapse like a stranger who had nothing to do with it. For Luo Fan, the birth of this island was just a way for him to try the cultivation route of other 6 tribulation experts in the 6th layer of the road to Tao Master. But it was not a cultivation that he absolutely could not give up. Later, after the abnormal consciousness was derived from the nature of the middle-aged woman, the function of the island was unknowingly transferred to become a place for gambling. But now, after he figured out the source of the abnormal consciousness, this purpose had become insignificant. After such several transformations, the significance of this island to Luo Fan, although it could not be said that it was no longer of any use, it had become insignificant. Therefore, at this moment, he could calmly sit and watch the battle between the middle-aged woman and the abnormal consciousness, and the impact produced by the collision of the dimensional division interweaving, but it was becoming more and more destructive to this world. The middle-aged woman could not understand Luo Fan's choice at first, but soon she understood that this was her opportunity. Of course, it was her wish to fight against the abnormal will that was born from the essence. However, during the process of this battle, Luo Fan had been watching from the side, which was also extremely uncomfortable for her. After all, although it was not necessary, she did not have the ability to stop Luo Fan from watching from the side. However, this did not mean that Luo Fan's existence did not pose any danger to them. In fact, it was the opposite. To her, Luo Fan's existence was equivalent to a rope wrapped around her neck, which could tighten and take her life at any time. Faced with such a predicament, how could the middle-aged woman not have any thoughts? How could she be willing to accept such a restriction? Naturally, she had to seize all possibilities when there was a chance to get rid of this restriction. Therefore, in her subsequent battle against the abnormal will, not only did she no longer limit the damage the impact had on the outside world, she even added fuel to the fire, directing more of the creatinine impact toward the outside world, towards an island that restricted and shackled her. The abnormal consciousness immediately knew what she was thinking. After all, the abnormal consciousness could be said to be another possibility for the middle-aged woman, another direction of development. Under such circumstances, the middle-aged woman's actions reflected what she was thinking. It was as clear as what her actions represented what she was thinking. The middle-aged woman knew that she could not hide her thoughts from the abnormal consciousness. However, just like how the abnormal consciousness knew what she was thinking, she also thought that she knew what the abnormal consciousness was thinking. At this moment, although Luo Fan was only watching quietly from the side, in fact, Luo Fan's existence did not only create pressure on the middle-aged woman, but it was also a huge pressure on the abnormal consciousness. After all, this was Luo Fan's island, his world. At this moment, they were completely in each other's world. In this case, no matter who won or lost, they would still end up in Luo Fan's hands in the end. Therefore, even if they were enemies, Luo Fan was definitely their common enemy. The middle-aged woman believed that the abnormal consciousness would definitely not refuse to get rid of Luo Fan's threat before getting rid of each other. Because of this, she did not care at all that the abnormal consciousness knew her intentions. In fact, she was even hoping that the abnormal consciousness would cooperate with her. As long as the abnormal consciousness was willing to cooperate, the possibility of them breaking free from Luo Fan's control would increase greatly. Just as the middle-aged woman thought, the abnormal consciousness did not make any targeted moves after knowing the middle-aged woman's intentions. Instead, it faintly guided the impact produced by their confrontation and did its best to direct the impact outward, toward the world outside the vortex. Through this change, the damage to the outside world became more and more severe. Vaguely, the feeling of the end of the world also became more intense and obvious. In the face of such a situation, Luo Fan was still unmoved. He just quietly watched everything that was happening. It was as if the life and death of this world had nothing to do with him, and the abnormal consciousness and the middle-aged woman's schemes did not affect him at all. His behavior made the middle-aged woman grit her teeth. No matter what, she was still a seven tribulation powerhouse and was already used to being a powerhouse. She knew very well what kind of mentality a powerhouse would have. At this moment, Luo Fan's behavior was the most vivid embodiment of the mentality of powerhouse. It was because he had absolute confidence that he could control everything, suppress everything, and make it so that no matter how things changed, they would not be able to escape his control. That was why he was so calm just now, as if he did not care about anything and did not care about anything. This kind of attitude was usually directed at others. Now, someone had actually developed such a mentality, such an attitude, and such a feeling. To her, it was needless to say how sullen and humiliating it was. Just you wait. When I find an opportunity, I will definitely let you know who is the powerhouse and who is the weakling, the middle-aged woman thought to herself. However, as soon as this thought flashed through her mind, she immediately felt discouraged. This was because the powerhouse and the weakling had already been determined a long time ago. All the previous encounters had clearly proven that she was only a weakling in front of Luo Fan. After feeling discouraged, she quickly set a new goal. She did not dare to think about defeating Luo Fan directly. However, to make Luo Fan's plan fail and make him suffer a big loss, this kind of thing did not seem to be a difficult thing to do. In particular, Luo Fan's arrogant attitude gave her a great opportunity. If the abnormal consciousness cooperated in the dark, it was not impossible for Luo Fan to suffer a huge loss in the end. As she thought to herself, her confidence rose again. The following situation seemed to evolve smoothly, just like the middle-aged woman's plan. The battle between her and the abnormal consciousness was still as intense as ever, and they were indeed fighting each other continuously. They were constantly competing with each other's techniques, abilities, powers, and realms. However, at the same time, they were also closely cooperating from another perspective. Under their secret guidance, the various destructive forces that leaked out from their fight were constantly vented toward the island that Luo Fan had built, and they kept destroying one of the layers of the world. Chapter 3056. Due to their secret guidance, the entire world seemed to have returned to its chaotic state in just a few short months. At a glance, the entire world had turned into a dusky expanse. Time, space, matter, energy, laws, vitality, and so on and so forth. Everything had unknowingly fused together. At this moment, the entire world seemed to no longer have any order to speak of. All order had apparently been completely destroyed by the cooperation between the middle-aged woman and the unusual consciousness a few months ago. Of course, if there was any place other than the battlefield that still had order, it would be the place where Luo Fan was at this moment. Even in this almost chaotic place, Luo Fan was still floating calmly on the spot. Of course, this place was originally a void, but it was now boundless chaos. He was merely floating in the air by himself, yet he was able to repel all chaos. Around his body, the space-time dimension that belonged to him naturally smoothed out all the chaos in the surroundings, allowing the surrounding time, space, matter, energy, rules, vitality, and so on to act according to his thoughts, naturally turning into a small world. Of course, the range was not wide. It only turned the area within several thousand feet of him into a small world. Of course, this was not because his order's influence could only extend to this range. Instead, it was because he had the intention to limit his order's influence to this range. After all, if he truly released his order's influence, the entire world and even the entire 365 levels would directly fall into the range of his order's influence. When that happened, all the influence caused by the middle-aged woman and the unusual consciousness would be for naught. For Luo Fan, who wanted to see how the battle between them would develop, what the final outcome would be, and what form the outcome would take, This situation was obviously unacceptable to him. Therefore, at this moment, in order to see the outcome, he forcefully restricted the influence of his order on his surroundings, limiting the area of influence to a radius of several hundred meters around him. Through this restriction, he didn't have to suppress himself too much, and his existence could be stretched to a certain extent. But at the same time, it would also give the middle-aged woman and the abnormal a chance to display their plan perfectly. At that moment, the middle-aged woman's eyes lit up. The development of the situation was even smoother than the most perfect situation she had imagined. She had originally thought that there would be some twists and turns in the matter, but she had never expected that she would forcefully reach this step and destroy the world to such an extent. What she needed to do next was to push this destruction one step further and finally push it into other worlds, pushing it into every region of this island. As long as he could complete this expansion and completely destroy the entire island, he would definitely be able to get his main body to directly take action and directly wipe out her avatar, along with the abnormal will. At that time, no matter what plans or thoughts Luo Fan had, it would obviously come to nothing. Once his plan fell through, it would mean that his plans for the past few months, or even the plans for the past few years, would all be for naught. He would definitely be a waste of time and energy, but he would get nothing out of it. This might not be considered a great loss to Luo Fan in terms of strength and energy, but the sense of defeat it brought him was definitely not weak. To a certain extent, this could be considered as a huge loss to Luo Fan, and to a certain extent, this had obviously achieved the middle-aged woman's goal. Although this goal was still insignificant compared to the goals of her previous plans. Under such circumstances, this was clearly the only thing he could pursue. I hope you're still as careless as before. At this time, the middle-aged woman was actually looking forward to Luo Fan maintaining the mentality of a powerhouse. He still felt that everything was under his control, and he still believed that no matter what happened, he would be able to easily deal with it. Due to their cooperation over the past few months, she thought that her cooperation with the abnormal consciousness was already quite perfect. Therefore, at this moment, she did not consider the possibility that the abnormal consciousness would have a different opinion from her. Even if her final plan was to completely wipe out the abnormal consciousness along with her clone, she would still think the same. It was not that she was too egoistic, but because the cooperation over the past few months had long given her the illusion that the abnormal consciousness was connected to her mind and that the abnormal consciousness had the same goal as her. It was precisely because of this illusion that she had such a mentality at this moment. After a few months of development, although the way they fought was still a battle between the means of dividing the dimensions, there were already a lot of things added to this battle that were not there before. For example, there were a large number of concept esoteric abilities, all sorts of strange energies, and countless indescribable powers that were buried in the countless dimensions and engaged in an extremely intense battle. Due to such a battle, the vortex at the intersection no longer looked like a vortex. Instead, it looked like a boundless world cluster with countless worlds. In fact, compared to ordinary world clusters, it looked even more complicated and incomprehensible. After all, ordinary world clusters were not divided into dimensions, and all the worlds were on the same level. However, at this moment, the vortex was divided into countless dimensions. The countless substances, energies, and strange existences seemed to overlap, but in fact, they did not intersect at all. It was as if they were words on different pages. As the words on different pages of a book, if the pages were thin, one could see the words on the other pages of the book through the pages. However, it was obvious that there was a natural chasm between the different pages, and they could not come into contact with each other at all. In fact, if the words on the pages had consciousness, they would not be aware of the existence of the other pages at all. At this time, all sorts of strange things in the infinite dimensions were similar to this. To them, their world was only the dimension they were in. Apart from the dimension, everything else did not exist to them at all. As for whether they had consciousness or not, it was needless to say. Creating living beings and consciousness was not even considered a matter of lifting a finger for existences at the level of a seventh tribulation powerhouse. With just a thought, billions of worlds could be created out of thin air, let alone things with consciousness. That was right. These things with consciousness were not all living beings. There are all sorts of strange things. They could be energy, inanimate objects, magic powers, certain spaces, a certain period of time, or even the dimension itself. At this moment, the things created by the middle-aged woman and the things created by the abnormal willpower were engaged in an extremely intense battle in those dimensions. The scale of the competition had a different kind of indescribable grandeur compared to when it first started. Seems like she's going to win. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was watching coldly from the side, had such a thought. The she he was talking about was not the middle-aged woman, but the abnormal willpower. Unlike the middle-aged woman who had been completely misled by the illusion, Luo Fan, who was watching from the side, could clearly see all the changes in the universe behind the vortex. Compared to the middle-aged woman, who placed almost all of her energy on the battle at the boundary and her scheme against Luo Fan, the abnormal willpower placed more attention on the universe. The attention they paid to this intersection was only limited to the middle-aged woman's cooperation. In fact, it was precisely because of this that the middle-aged woman felt that everything was going smoothly. She felt that the abnormal willpower was already connected to her mind, and its goal was also completely the same as hers. After a few months of development, she had clearly obtained extremely shocking results. At this moment, the universe had completely changed. At this moment, the starry sky of the universe no longer looked the same as before. The starry sky of the universe now looked like a huge whirlpool. The countless stars had already shifted their positions under the adjustment of the abnormal will. Although it was not random, it was not too orderly either. It had completely converged into a huge vortex that was extremely similar to the one manifested by the abnormal will. It was just that the scale of the vortex was countless times larger. Corresponding to this change, in the space-time where the abnormal willpower resided, the island that was originally the origin of the abnormal willpower had completely collapsed. The entire island had directly broken into pieces, and it had already completely integrated with all the stars in the universe. Or rather, it had completely fused with the huge vortex of stars in the starry sky of the universe. The abnormal willpower had clearly completely integrated with the universe and was no longer the same as before. Although it had become the essence or the will of the universe, it was still a willpower that was produced because of the abnormality. It was like a second personality that a person had developed. It was naturally very difficult for such a willpower to integrate with the universe. As long as one could think of a way to erase it, it wouldn't be difficult. But now, after such a thorough integration, the word abnormal from the abnormal willpower could clearly be removed. After such an integration, the relationship between the willpower and the universe was already so close that no existence could separate them. It could be said that at this stage, the universe was a part of the willpower, and the willpower was also an inseparable part of the universe. If the two were forcefully separated, then whether it was the universe or the willpower, they would become incomplete and might even completely collapse. If this was compared to a person, it would be equivalent to the person's second personality completely replacing the first personality and becoming the person's true personality, true self, and true consciousness. At this stage, if one wanted to erase this personality, it would be equivalent to killing the person. The significance of such an impact to the willpower was self-evident. It could be said that at this stage, the willpower could be considered to have truly become a new individual, and it could truly be considered to have obtained the foundation for an independent existence. If that was all, Luo Fan would at most be impressed by the willpower's brilliant methods, but he wouldn't think that the willpower had already won. This was why he was even more certain that the willpower had already won. The reason was very simple. It was because at this moment, the willpower was gradually changing the shape of the entire universe. Although the moment Luo Fan stepped into the cosmic starry sky, it looked like a cosmic starry sky of its own, like a world of its own. However, it was clear that this situation was not natural. Its true appearance was the essence of the middle-aged woman who had the appearance of a seventh tribulation powerhouse. This true appearance meant that the appearance of the universe was actually just a form of the willpower. Furthermore, it might even just be a form that Luo Fan's consciousness and Luo Fan's choice had revealed itself. As an essence, its true appearance naturally wouldn't just be the appearance of the universe. On the contrary, this appearance could actually be considered a kind of distortion and dispersion to this essence. A distortion to make it easier for the willpower to understand and comprehend, and a dispersion to make it harder for the willpower to resist. Now that the willpower had begun to change this distortion and dispersion, it was obviously changing the situation that was easy to understand and difficult to resist. It turned out that the willpower could fight on par with the middle-aged woman. If its power became more condensed and its strength became more powerful, was there any need to say more about how the battle between the willpower and the middle-aged woman would turn out? It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan made such a judgment at this moment. He was certain that the willpower was already destined to win. However, it was obvious that the middle-aged woman clearly didn't feel anything about Luo Fan's judgment or the changes behind the willpower. Chapter 3057. At this moment, the seventh tribulation powerhouse, who looked like a middle-aged woman, had clearly been slightly blinded by the desire in her heart. If this little bit of blinding was used on an ordinary person, it would only make them slightly more stubborn. It would not have too much of an impact. However, if it was used on this middle-aged woman at this moment, the effect of this slight bit of blinding was obviously not so simple. Although it was only a little bit of blinding, under this kind of blinding, the middle-aged woman had already unknowingly overlooked that the standpoint of the willpower was completely different from hers, and thus neglected the plan behind the willpower. And the result of this was that her failure was almost completely determined. Just when Luo Fan made this judgment, the willpower finally completed its plan. At this moment, it was also the time that the middle-aged woman decided to go one step further and push the chaos of this world into other worlds. At this moment, the middle-aged woman suddenly felt empty in her heart. The endless power that was originally at her whim suddenly lost most of it, leaving only the part that she released, which was still under her control. What's going on? This thought instantly flashed through her mind. However, very soon, she suddenly realized what kind of mistake she had made. After all, the blinding she had received was extremely slight. It was just like an ordinary person who had become slightly stubborn. It was not difficult for her to wake up. At this moment, the instant that feeling of being at her whim suddenly disappeared, she suddenly felt her mind clear up, and the influence that the blinding had on her was instantly suppressed. After suppressing the blinding, it was impossible for her not to know what she had previously overlooked. However, it was obvious that she had realized it now too late. At this moment, the vortex in front of her suddenly began to shrink rapidly. In the blink of an eye, it shrank from a vortex to the appearance of a woman. This woman was somewhat similar to her. Anyone could tell at a glance that this woman had an extremely close relationship with her. However, there was a huge difference between this woman and her, and that was that this woman was extremely young. She looked to be about 16 or 17 years old, which was the appearance of a young person. Around this woman, the area where space-time and the world intersected had completely collapsed. At this moment, what replaced that area was the endless chaos around it. It was as chaotic as the primal chaos. Apart from that, there was nothing else. No matter what universe, what world, what space-time, they could no longer be found. With one look, one could tell that this was the essence. The starry sky of the universe had completely transformed into this 16 or 17-year-old girl. Thank you for your cooperation. Now, I am truly free. After the woman appeared, she smiled at the middle-aged woman. As she spoke, an indescribable power suddenly appeared out of thin air around her, completely enveloping her. This power was so mysterious. After it enveloped him, it seemed to be gradually pulling him into an indescribable place, causing his figure to become more and more blurry, more and more illusory. Ordinary creatures might not know about this power, But both Luo Fan and the middle-aged woman knew that this power was none other than the power of the Tao Master's path. In other words, it was the fundamental rule of the Tao Master's path. It seems that it's the second situation. At this time, Luo Fan let out a sigh. The second situation he mentioned was naturally the two guesses he made when the incarnation became completely independent and cut off the connection with the original body. Among them, the first guess he made was that the incarnation would stay on the 6th level of the Tao Master's path after becoming independent, and the restrictions of the Tao Master's prison would disappear completely. The second guess was that the current situation of the will, because there was no record of it in the previous levels of the Tao Master's path. Therefore, once it became completely independent, the fundamental rule of the Tao Master's path would directly transfer it to the first level of the Tao Master's path. It would need to ascend again and again before it could return to this place. However, although the will in front of him was in the second situation, Luo Fan did not think that the first situation was wrong. Recalling all the things he had seen on the 5th level of the Tao Master's path, perhaps the first situation was actually also possible. After all, weren't the relatives and friends of the 6 tribulation and 7 tribulation experts in the same situation? Perhaps there was some room for choice in this matter. Of course, whether there was really a choice, or whether it was a random situation, or whether there were more complicated factors that determined the situation for the time being, obviously could only be guessed. After all, it was impossible for Luo Fan to personally confirm the situation. Under such circumstances, no matter how he guessed in the end, it was obvious that he could only guess. Don't worry, we still have a long way to go. We will meet again in the future. At this time, such words came from the gradually disappearing figure. After saying such words, the figure completely disappeared without a trace. The middle-aged woman at this time, she let out a long breath, turned her head to look at Luo Fan, who had been looking around for a few months, and sighed, "Fellow Taoist, you have long seen through this." "I only saw a part of it." Luo Fan just smiled. The middle-aged woman smiled bitterly. "My behavior in the past few months is quite ridiculous in your eyes." Luo Fan shook his head and said, "There is nothing ridiculous about it. I just think it is quite interesting." At this time, without the continuous impact of the destruction, the chaos in this layer of the world began to gradually fade, and the order that had been completely destroyed began to quickly recover at this time. The chaotic appearance had been gradually destroyed, and the world gradually became clear again. All kinds of energy, all kinds of matter, and all kinds of rules also began to gradually return to their places. Before long, the world that the middle-aged woman had spent several months to completely mess up would return to its normal state, as if it had never been destroyed or messed up. Of course, the mountain formed by the essence, naturally, could not still exist. After all, the essence had turned into an existence close to the existence of a 7 tribulation expert, and was transferred to the first layer of the Tao Master Road. The middle-aged woman sighed and said, "Fellow Taoist, how do you plan to treat me next? What do you think about refining your essence again?" Luo Fan said with a smile. The middle-aged woman rolled her eyes and said, "Fellow Taoist, do you think I am a fool? How can I make the same mistake twice? My essence has long since been destroyed. What is left here now is only equivalent to a puppet. I do not believe that you can refine my essence from this puppet." Luo Fan nodded naturally. Indeed, the middle-aged woman in front of him at this moment was indeed just a puppet-like body. Even if such a body was refined, it would only be the essence of a puppet, and it could not be the essence of the middle-aged woman who looked like a 7 tribulation expert. Therefore, the thought of extracting some sort of essence from it was obviously completely futile. "There are a lot of things that I want from you, Taoist, but it is a pity that you do not cooperate, so there is nothing I can get. So, I think it's time to say goodbye." Luo Fan sighed. "I see. What a pity. I hope we will not meet again in the future." The middle-aged woman said helplessly. It was impossible for her to have no hatred or resentment towards Luo Fan. On the contrary, she simply hated Luo Fan. Don't forget what Luo Fan did. At the very beginning, he destroyed one of her cultivation in the 6th level of the Tao Master's Path. Just this point alone could be considered as a huge grudge. After that, he even refined his own essence and created an independent will within his essence. Finally, he became completely independent and became an independent existence that knew almost all of his secrets, weaknesses, and even viewed him as an irreconcilable enemy. After such behavior, no matter how magnanimous she was, it was impossible for her not to have any resentment towards Luo Fan. It could be said that if there was a chance, she would definitely do everything possible to kill Luo Fan. However, it was a pity that she was a 7 Tribulation expert after all. As a 7 Tribulation expert, it was obviously not difficult for her to measure the strength of the enemy and her own strength. Now, Luo Fan was only at the 6th level of the Tao Master's Path, but he had already made her feel disgraced. If she had not been cautious, even her real body would have suffered a great loss because of this. Under such circumstances, if Luo Fan ascended to the 7th level of the Tao Master's Path and really stood on the same foundation as her, it could be imagined how much of an advantage his strength would have over her. In that case, if she and Luo Fan were to encounter each other, it would obviously be impossible for her to take revenge for today's enmity. Instead, it would be Luo Fan who had finished his unfinished work this time and would plot against her to the end. After clearly understanding this, no matter how unwilling she was, obviously, she could only avoid Luo Fan and would rather never see Luo Fan again. As for the hatred between them, obviously, she could only swallow it first, which was the most beneficial for her. Hearing this, Luo Fan could not help but feel a little disappointed and said, "Don't you have the slightest bit of courage? I made you suffer such a big loss. You should try your best to find me for revenge, right? Why don't I want to take revenge? However, I'm not strong enough. Maybe you can stay in this realm for a few trillion years and wait for me to break through to take revenge." The middle-aged woman said helplessly. Naturally, Luo Fan would not listen to her arrangement, not to mention that he was not willing to stay in this realm for a few trillion years. Even his 8th major tribulation would not come after a few trillion years. Now, he was only about 100 million years away from the 8th major tribulation. At that time, whether he was ready or not, the major tribulation would come to him. And once the major tribulation came, whether he succeeded or failed, it would be impossible for him to remain in the current realm. If he succeeded, needless to say, he would naturally be an 8 tribulation expert. If he failed, he would die, his Tao would disappear, and his soul would scatter. How would he have any cultivation realm to speak of? Therefore, even if he was willing, the middle-aged woman's arrangement was impossible for him. Of course, he was obviously not interested in explaining this to the middle-aged woman. At that moment, he only said, "You are not strong enough, but you can invite friends. After cultivating for so many years, you should have made some friends, right? Invite all of them to help you take revenge. You can't do it alone, but if there are a few of them, maybe you will succeed. Even if you don't have enough friends, you should have a master, right? If you don't have a master, pay some price to invite the Tao Venerate's disciples, and the effect will definitely be extremely great." At this moment, the middle-aged woman looked at Luo Fan with a gaze full of speechlessness. She naturally had friends, and there were quite a few of them. However, they were obviously only about the same as her. And if they were about the same strength, facing Luo Fan, no matter how many of them there were, they would just be sending themselves to his door. In this case, inviting them to deal with Luo Fan was obviously a trap for those friends. As for the masters and the like, there were some, but they were of no help to the current situation. After all, a 7 tribulation expert was not an ordinary person's realm. Apart from the Tao Venerate's disciples, who could guarantee that their importation could produce 2 7th tribulation experts. Therefore, as a 7 tribulation expert, her master had either passed away or was hovering around an even lower realm. What could they do by inviting such masters? As for inviting the Tao Venerate's disciples, that seemed to be the most helpful. However, what kind of existence were the Tao Venerate's disciples? Although the relationship between the Tao Venerate's disciples and the individual cultivators had eased up a lot in the 6th level and above of the path of Tao Venerate, there was still a huge gap between them. The Tao Venerate's disciples had the support of a true saint, and as a complete importation, as long as they continued to advance along the importation path, they would be able to reach the Tao. How could they look down on the individual cultivators? In this case, if she wanted to ask the Tao Venerate's disciples to help her deal with Luo Fan, the price she would have to pay would be so great that it would be enough to make her go bankrupt. Even if she went bankrupt, she might not be able to invite the Tao Venerate's disciples who were strong enough to threaten Luo Fan. And obviously, although the hatred between her and Luo Fan was deep, it was not enough for her to go bankrupt to take revenge. Even if she could be sure that she could successfully take revenge on Luo Fan after going bankrupt, she might not necessarily take action, not to mention that she could not be sure now. Therefore, at this time, in the face of these ideas of Luo Fan, she could only be speechless. Chapter 3058. What a pity. It was impossible for Luo Fan not to know what the middle-aged woman meant. At that moment, he could only feel that it was a pity. After all, he was rather looking forward to the middle-aged woman finding more enemies and powerhouses to be his opponents. It was not the kind of anticipation that came from the bottom of his heart. As for the reason, it was naturally not because he had some special fetish. Instead, it was because for him now, every time a powerful enemy appeared, it was equivalent to a powerful stimulation to his potential. After all, although the abilities that Luo Fan possessed were extremely powerful, he was still unfamiliar with how to combine these abilities to unleash the most powerful effect, and how to rely on these abilities to do all kinds of seemingly unbelievable things. It was not that he did not know, but that these things were lying in the depths of his heart and in the depths of his cognition. If there was no stimulation, they would continue to lie there. Under such circumstances, if there were powerhouses going against him now, through witnessing the powerhouses' means and being pressured by them, there was a great possibility that these hidden potentials would be stimulated. Once these potentials were stimulated, it would obviously be of great benefit to his future cultivation. It was precisely because of this that he was looking forward to the arrival of the enemies. However, it was obvious that the middle-aged woman's rationality made it impossible for her to do as Luo Fan wanted. At this moment, Luo Fan could only sigh as he raised his hand and pressed down on the middle-aged woman. Luo Fan's strength was far stronger than the middle-aged woman's. Even if the middle-aged woman's real body was here, he would probably be able to subdue her without much trouble. Moreover, it was only his puppet-like clone that was here at this moment. Moreover, this was not an ordinary place, but an island that he had constructed and was in a world that he had absolute control over. With so many advantages, subduing the middle-aged woman was naturally something that could be done with just a single thought. With such an action, the middle-aged woman suddenly felt an indescribable fear surging in her heart. For a moment, Luo Fan's seemingly ordinary palm seemed to fill up the world. Even the palm lines seemed to have turned into an inverted mountain range, crushing towards her along with the movement of the palm. What's the point of using this last move? The middle-aged woman sighed. As she sighed, she did not resist at all. She allowed the palm to come down and completely erase everything around her, including her clone. In fact, if she really wanted to resist with her strength, she could actually resist to a certain extent. After all, she was a 7th tribulation expert. As a 7th tribulation powerhouse, even if it was just an incarnation, even if it was just a puppet controlled by the main body, the power that it could unleash was not something that an ordinary 6th tribulation powerhouse could compare with. If he really wanted to resist, the possibility of harming Luo Fan was not high, but he could definitely last for several hours. With Luo Fan's attitude, he might be able to do it in a few days. But, obviously, that doesn't make any sense. With such a huge disparity in strength, the outcome of the battle between them had already been decided. Her failure was inevitable. In such a situation, her resistance would not bring her any benefits. On the contrary, it would allow Luo Fan to obtain the enemy that he dreamed of, and it would only bring some benefits to Luo Fan. After seeing this, it was obvious what choice the middle-aged woman would make. seeing that everything in that area was completely erased. Even space-time was completely destroyed, and the laws were completely erased, leaving only a hole that would not recover for a long time. Luo Fan could not help but feel a little disappointed. The reason why he dealt with the middle-aged woman in an absolutely crushing manner was to force the middle-aged woman to resist. But it was a pity that she could actually resist the desire to resist in such a situation. She actually forcefully endured his crushing and was directly erased by him. He sighed inwardly. With a thought, the power of the many worlds in this island began to gather, and the destruction left behind in this area was gradually expelled during this process. As the destruction was repelled, everything in the area began to gradually recover. Not long after, everything returned to how it was before. Only the middle-aged woman's figure had completely disappeared. After doing all this, Luo Fan did not continue to stay here. With a sway of his body, he left this layer of world and the island, reappearing in the void outside the island. He quietly hovered and looked down at the island. At this moment, the island seemed to be operating more smoothly than before, and the subtle sluggishness that originally had disappeared without a trace. Of course, this subtle sluggishness was only felt because of the smoothness at this moment. If one were to sense the original island normally, it would be difficult to sense the sluggishness. Perhaps it's not the right way to put foreign cultivators in it. Looking at the changes on the island after all the foreign forces were completely eliminated, such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. Currently, Luo Fan's true focus of cultivation was clearly on the illusory figures of the world of laws that existed in the countless layers of the nothingness ocean. However, this did not mean that he needed to devote all of his incarnations to it. In fact, it was not much pressure for him to separate some incarnations to carry out other cultivation and other things. Didn't the incarnation exist for this purpose? And now, the Luo Fan here was also Luo Fan's incarnation. Moreover, this incarnation had already carried out half of the cultivation here. Under such circumstances, he naturally would not directly waste the previous work of this incarnation and took it back. Although the island was no longer of any use to him, and the cultivation that the island represented was no longer as attractive to him as it was before, he did not care about the island at all. However, this was still a cultivation after all, and it was only half of the cultivation. Anyway, leaving this incarnation here would not pose any pressure to him, nor would it affect his other cultivation. In this case, he naturally could not be bothered to take this incarnation back and let it continue to cultivate here. The incarnation moved slightly at this moment, and the countless forces that had gathered on one layer of the 365 layers began to disperse to the other 364 layers. However, he did not completely restore those forces, but made certain adjustments to the distribution of those forces in the process. This adjustment was quite subtle, and there was no gradual pattern. Instead, the forces were distributed according to the respective characteristics of the 365 layers. As for the specific distribution standards, it was naturally too complicated to be described in words. If words were to be used to describe it, perhaps even billions of words would not be able to describe it clearly. After the indescribably complicated distribution, the island, which originally seemed no different from the many other islands in this layer of the void, began to show indescribable differences. At first glance, this island seemed to be no different from before. However, after careful observation, one would find that this island's sense of existence was much stronger than that of the other islands. Vaguely, there was a feeling that it was glowing. As for the flow of forces between the many worlds inside the island, it became more than 100 times smoother than before. If the flow of power before was like a smooth river, then the flow of power now was like a huge waterfall that had a drop of hundreds of meters. As this power flowed, the flow of time in the 365th level of the island began to accelerate at a crazy rate. Originally, the flow of time in the world of this island was already tens of thousands of times faster than the outside world. Now that it was further accelerated, the difference between the flow of time was even more unimaginable. Almost a few breaths of time in the outside world were equivalent to tens of thousands of years inside. The entire process was so natural that Luo Fan did not even make any adjustments to the flow of time. All the changes were caused by the island, or rather, the internal changes of the world of the 365 layers. In the face of such a situation, Luo Fan naturally knew that his previous redistribution of power might not be absolutely correct, but he was definitely walking in the right direction. Only in this way could the current changes occur. It seems that the cultivation represented by these islands is more mysterious than I imagined. At this time, such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. However, this was to be expected after thinking about it. After all, even a 7 tribulation expert was reluctant to cultivate by building an island. If this kind of cultivation was easy, why would the 7th tribulation expert, who looked like a middle-aged woman, go against the path of a Tao master to come to the 6th layer and build that island? Obviously, this kind of cultivation was also very beneficial to a 7th tribulation expert. Otherwise, she would not have done this. Looking at the huge difference between the island he built and the other islands in this layer of the void, Luo Fan had inexplicable doubts in his mind. If his island was walking in the right direction, then what about the other islands? There were so many cultivators, it was impossible that all of them were walking in the wrong direction, even if Luo Fan was extremely confident that he was different from other cultivators. He was absolutely not so confident that his achievements in the 6th layer of the Tao Master's path had surpassed the achievements of hundreds of millions of 6th tribulation experts in the past hundreds of millions of years on the 6th layer of the Tao Master's path. There might be a secret that he did not know yet. The purpose of the existence of this incarnation of Luo Fan was obviously to figure out the cultivation of this island. Under such circumstances, the incarnation naturally did not need to pay attention to anything else and only needed to figure out the secrets of this island. Therefore, even if the other incarnations and real bodies of Luo Fan were extremely busy and had more important cultivation to carry out, his incarnation did not need to pay attention to anything else at all and only needed to focus on the cultivation of this island. Hence, at this moment, the incarnation that had doubts in its heart moved slightly, and it headed towards the nearest island in this layer of nothingness. Although it was the nearest island, this layer of the void was really too big. Even the nearest island was extremely far away from Luo Fan's island. It was precisely because of the distance that the battle that happened here before did not attract the attention of other cultivators. Faced with such a long distance, it was not easy for even Luo Fan to cross such a long distance. At least, it was not easy to cross such a long distance in this layer. In the end, it took him a few days to cross this long distance, and he came to the nearest island. Compared to Luo Fan's island, this island was more like a market. Although the number of cultivators on this island was many times less than that of the truly prosperous islands, there were still tens of thousands of 6 tribulation experts on this island. These 6 tribulation experts on this island were like ordinary people in a market, and they all behaved differently. Some were extremely leisurely, some were extremely busy, some were doing business, and some were purely for entertainment. Such an island naturally did not prohibit others from approaching. At this moment, Luo Fan's arrival instantly attracted the attention of a large number of 6 tribulation experts. However, they were not very interested in his arrival. Some even glanced at him, and some did not even look at him. If an ordinary cultivator came to such an island, they would definitely enter it. However, it was obvious that Luo Fan's goal was not the various services provided on the island. Instead, it was the island itself. Therefore, at this moment, he did not step into the island. Instead, he stayed outside the island and looked at the island with a probing gaze. It doesn't look like there's anything special about it. At least, there's nothing special about its structure. It seems like it's simply opening up a space-time and constructing an island. Luo Fan looked at the island, and this was his first impression. The island looked very ordinary, and it was essentially no different from the island that he had not adjusted before. It was also no different from the prison that the middle-aged woman built. The only difference was that the services provided, or rather, the rules set were slightly different. Chapter 3059. Sensing the situation on the island, Luo Fan's clone couldn't help but frown. He could imagine that the other islands in this layer of the void should be in a similar situation. If that was the case, what kind of cultivation goals did the owners of these islands, the six tribulation powerhouses, place on these islands? What were the similarities and differences between those cultivation goals and the cultivation goals that he had placed on them? Faced with this situation, Luo Fan's heart moved slightly. He instantly released his perception and directly covered the entire island. At this moment, many powerhouses on the island seemed to have sensed that something was different around them, as if some of their secrets were being probed by some existence. However, although Luo Fan's perception wasn't too hidden, because he had already reached the peak of the seven tribulation, his level was already far stronger than the six tribulation powerhouses. Therefore, even if he didn't deliberately conceal himself and just instinctively didn't want to attract too much attention, the six tribulation powerhouses couldn't sense his perception. Therefore, at this moment, although they could vaguely sense that there seemed to be some existence spying on them in a way that they couldn't understand, they could only sense this. However, that was all they could sense. As for the specifics, they did not know where the investigation came from, what the purpose of the investigation was, and so on and so forth. Looks like this isn't a place to stay for long. This thought appeared in the minds of many powerhouses. Shortly after, the six tribulation powerhouses began to leave the island one after another. After all, this island was free to enter and exit, and it was similar to an island market. The reason why the six tribulation powerhouses stayed on this island was because it made them feel convenient and comfortable, and now there was an indescribable existence spying on them. Even if they didn't know the source of this spying and didn't understand the purpose of this spying, just this feeling alone was enough to suppress the comfortable and convenient feeling they had. Therefore, there was no need to say what their choice was. Before long, there were only a few six tribulation powerhouses left on the island. These few people either had some matters to attend to on this island that they simply couldn't leave, or they were cultivators who felt that this kind of spying on them didn't matter to them at all, and that there was nothing they couldn't tell others about. This kind of change should have attracted the attention of the owner of the island. However, such attention did not appear. No matter how many cultivators left, even if there were only a few people left, this island seemed to have no owner. No experts came out to deal with the problem. Based on this situation, it was clear that although this island did have an owner, the owner was clearly not here, nor did he treat this island as the focus of his attention. That was the only way for such a situation to occur. Luo Fan didn't mind the situation at all. At this moment, he didn't even try to conceal his own perception. He simply added the thought that he didn't want his perception to be too conspicuous, so that those six tribulation experts wouldn't be able to trace the source of his perception. He sent his perception into the depths of the island, analyzing everything about the island from the outside to the inside. This included the space-time structure of the island, the structure of its laws, and the connection between it and the void ocean. Among them, the last point was obviously the key. After all, such an island could exist anywhere. However, it was only in the nothingness ocean that the effects of cultivation could be achieved. Therefore, the true secret of this island should be related to the nothingness ocean layer. The connection between the island and the void ocean was obviously of utmost importance. As for why he chose to comprehend on the islands of other cultivators instead of the island formed by his 365 world layers, the reason was naturally because his island was clearly different from the islands of other cultivators. Because his island was so different from other cultivators' islands, the mysteries of other islands would have a great effect on the mysteries contained in the interaction between his own island and the surrounding nothingness ocean layer. This island had almost no protection against its own secrets. As Luo Fan's perception penetrated into the depths of the island, he didn't feel any resistance at all. His perception easily penetrated the deepest part of the island and cut through all the surface to see the true core of the island. He saw the crux of the island. This crux was the connection between the island and the outside void ocean. Or rather, it was some kind of indescribable communication between the two. The entire island was almost completely derived from this connection. All the laws, time, and space on the island seemed independent. But at the bottom of it, they could all be traced back to this connection. Obviously, everything could be said to exist for this connection. That kind of indescribable communication was similar to the exchange between the heavens and the void sea. Every moment, there would be some kind of existence entering the island from the void sea through this kind of connection. At the same time, there was also some kind of existence on the island that entered the surrounding void ocean through this connection. During this process, the island was undergoing some kind of extremely subtle but seemingly crucial change at every moment. Faintly, it seemed to become more complicated, more natural, more mysterious, and more real, more natural, more real. Feeling the effect of this connection, Luo Fan suddenly understood something in his heart. The difference between this island and his island might be like the difference between the right way and the wrong way of cultivation. For cultivation, the right way was to constantly gather ideas. Finally, after countless years, when the gathered ideas were truly complete and formed a real worldview, it could push the cultivator to the true divine realm. The wrong way, on the other hand, formed a unique worldview from the beginning. Later, through repeated cultivation, improvement, and refinement, the worldview was pushed to the perfect level, and then the cultivator was pushed to the true divine realm. Similarly, there was a similar difference between this island and Luo Fan's island. This island relied on the accumulation of endless time and the communication between the island and the surrounding void ocean to push the island to the real natural level, the real level. Relying on this change, the cultivator could understand some of the changes that occurred in the 6th level of the Tao Master's path. But Luo Fan's island was completely different. From the beginning, he had to forcibly step into this natural level, the real level. Later, by relying on the communication between the surrounding void ocean, this natural level, the real level, was gradually improved and perfected. Finally, after countless efforts, it achieved the same effect as the other islands. It could be said that the goal of Luo Fan's island was the same as the other islands, but the path they took was completely different. For example, the goal of the right way and the wrong way was to become a true divine, but the path in between was different. After understanding this, Luo Fan already knew what he should do. Through the changes of the island, he first transformed my heavens. This is my cultivation path. Such a thought flashed through his mind. With that thought in mind, his silhouette flashed, and he disappeared from the island. When he reappeared, he had already returned to his island. When leaving one's own island to go to another island, one had to open a path from scratch, which naturally took a lot of effort and time. However, returning to one's own island from another island was completely different. This was because the path had already been opened, and his own island was also in front of him. Naturally, he could directly cross the path between the two islands in a way that was similar to crossing time and space. He did not need to go through the intermediate process to directly return to his own island. After arriving outside his own island, Luo Fan thought for a while and did not stay there. He lifted his foot again and directly walked into the island that was formed by the overlapping of the 365 worlds. At the same time he stepped onto the island, his body gradually disintegrated, turning into strands of indescribable air currents that gradually swept through the surrounding world. By the time he stepped onto the island, his figure had completely integrated into the island. At the instant he completely fused with the island, it was as if the island had become his body. He seemed to have become the island's consciousness, the island's will. Following this change, all the secrets on the island seemed to have been lifted in front of him. Everything was revealed to him, no matter how big or small. At the same time, a subtle feeling of awkwardness also appeared in his heart. Due to this feeling of awkwardness, he knew that the island had become natural and real, but in fact, it had not reached the extreme. At the very least, it had not reached the extreme that he could do. There were still too many aspects of the island that could be perfected, and there were still too many areas that could continue to be adjusted. The reason for this was very simple. It was not because he had made great progress in such a short period of time. Instead, it was because he had only been adjusting the power of the island from the outside. This time, he had completely integrated with the island. Previously, when he was adjusting the power of the island from the outside, it was like observing the scenery through a layer of frosted glass. No matter how hard he tried, there was still a layer between him and the scenery, and he could not see the true appearance of the scenery. After truly integrating with the island, the frosted glass between him and the scenery was naturally taken away. His perception naturally became clearer, and he naturally sensed more details. Because of this, he could sense more details that he had not noticed before, and he discovered more areas that he had not done to the extreme before. Since he had sensed it, Luo Fan naturally could not allow those areas that he had not done to the extreme to continue existing. With a slight thought, the 365th world inside the island began to tremble slightly. As it trembled, the power inside the 365th world also began to flow. On the basis of the original distribution of power, a more detailed distribution gradually took shape. As this change happened, each world became more and more real and natural during this process. Correspondingly, the flow of time in each world also became faster and faster during this process. In the end, when Luo Fan felt that everything was perfect and that all the adjustments had reached the limit that he could do, the island seemed to have turned into a huge sun that hung in the nothingness of the ocean layer. Even the slowest time flow was equivalent to trillions of years in the outside world in a breath of time. In a certain world where the flow of time was the fastest, a breath of time in the outside world was equivalent to tens of thousands of reincarnations. As for why such an island would become so eye-catching in the nothingness of the ocean layer like a huge sun, the reason was that it was different from the bright moon that the island had turned into before. Previously, because the power was concentrated, the island became brighter, and the difference between it and the surrounding environment became too obvious. But now, the island had turned into a huge sun because its presence had far surpassed the nothingness of the ocean layer in the large area around the island. Because its presence was too strong, countless six tribulation powerhouses would naturally focus their attention on this island as long as they could sense this area. It was just like how, as long as it was daytime, everyone would immediately notice the existence of the sun. At this time, the attention of many six tribulation powerhouses on this island had even unknowingly suppressed the attention they paid to the projection of the world of law that appeared in almost every layer of the ocean of nothingness. With the island in the nothingness ocean layer, its presence was superior to the projection of the world that was like a landmark. This result was something that Luo Fan had never expected. As this change happened, a sense of perception began to spread from all over the island. An inexplicable feeling of being spied on spread along with this perception, constantly appearing in Luo Fan's heart, making him feel slightly irritated. Chapter 3060. As time passed, more and more six tribulation experts began to come to the island from all directions. Thus, as time passed, more and more six tribulation powerhouses began to gather towards this island from all directions. There were even some cultivators who directly stepped into the island and entered the first of the 365 levels. For the cultivators on the 6th level of the Tao Master's Path, they could enter and exit the islands in the void ocean at will as long as there were no explicit instructions. At least, they had unknowingly developed such a habit over the years. After all, more than 99% of the islands in the void ocean layer did not reject their entry and exit. They could come and go as they pleased. After experiencing so many islands, even these six tribulation experts would unknowingly change their views. They would treat the freedom to enter and exit the islands as an unwritten rule. With such a habit, they would directly enter the island after discovering it. Of course, the island was quite strange after all. Although the six tribulation experts thought that they could freely enter and exit the island, they also knew that the safety of such an island was uncertain. Therefore, the six tribulation experts who entered the island, or rather, the first of the 365 levels, were almost all incarnations. Obviously, even if something happened to their incarnations after entering the island, it would not cause much damage to the cultivators themselves. At least, in most cases, there would not be much damage. That was the reason why they were so daring. The time flow in the first level was not the fastest among the 365 levels, but it was not the slowest either. A breath in the outside world was only equivalent to 3 to 5 reincarnations in this world. Naturally, the 6 tribulation experts could not stay in such a world for too long. At least, it was too long for the outside world. After they entered that world, they had practically left that world in the blink of an eye and returned to the outside world. And every cultivator who returned to the outside world had a slightly dazed look in their eyes. Obviously, the huge difference in the flow of time in the outside world was difficult for these 6 tribulation experts to accept. After leaving that world, he was still shocked by the difference in time between the outside world and the long time he had spent in that world. This kind of thing happened to more and more cultivators. As more and more cultivators gathered around the island, they also became more and more silent. At some point in time, a cultivator loudly asked, "Fellow Taoists, have you obtained any information from it?" Although most of the cultivators had entered that world before, the difference in the flow of time inside and outside was too great. Those cultivators had almost instantly left the world after entering, so they hadn't had any contact with each other in that world. Moreover, because every breath in the outside world was equivalent to 3 to 5 cycles of life and death in that world, the appearance of that world, the rules of that world, the customs of that world, the environment of that world, were all different. It could even be said that there was no similarity between them. Therefore, not a single cultivator knew what other cultivators had seen, discovered, encountered, or obtained in that world. They could only be sure of what they had encountered, discovered, and obtained in that world. One of the 6 tribulation experts said, "Fellow Taoist doesn't need to take chances. We should all have obtained about the same things in that world. If you can't get the information, we naturally can't get it either," said a 6 tribulation expert. Hearing this, the cultivator turned to look at the other cultivators. When he saw that everyone had expressions of agreement, he knew that the cultivator was right. Sure enough, although they had seen and heard different things, their gains were about the same. There wasn't a single cultivator who gained more than any other cultivator. At this moment, the cultivator said, "In that case, I have a suggestion. What do you all think?" The other cultivators all turned their gazes towards him. It was clear that they were very interested in his suggestion. The cultivator didn't keep them in suspense and said, "Since it's difficult to obtain information by entering separately, why don't we all enter together and explore that world together?" Hearing this, the other cultivators' eyes lit up. If they entered that world alone, it would be difficult for them to obtain anything. On the other hand, the experiences of others entering that world wouldn't be of any use as a reference. In this case, if everyone stepped into the island at the same time, they would be able to see many things that they couldn't see clearly through the different perspectives they brought. In this way, the possibility of them obtaining some benefits was many times higher than if they were to enter alone. All of the 6 tribulation experts understood this point. Thus, at this moment, everyone agreed with this suggestion. They were all 6 tribulation experts, so their efficiency was naturally quite astonishing. Since they had already decided on this method, it naturally began to take shape. For ordinary mortals, it would naturally be extremely difficult for them to accurately calculate time at the same time. Even after thousands of times of training, they might not be able to do it. However, for existences at the level of 6 tribulation experts, accurate time to a billionth of an instant was no pressure for them. Of course, it wasn't difficult for them to enter that world at the same time. At this moment, they only needed to sense and communicate with each other. Their minds were connected, and they would naturally be able to do this. Even if there were tens of thousands of cultivators who decided to enter that world at the same time, it was the same. The tens of thousands of 6 tribulation experts' senses were connected. With a single thought, they disappeared from this island at the same time. They directly entered the island and appeared in the first level of the 365 levels. Of course, even though they were as accurate as possible, even accurately calculating the time, they entered that world to a billionth of an instant. However, due to the unimaginable difference in the flow of time between this world and the outside world, the six tribulation experts still didn't enter that world at the same time. Moreover, the difference between the fastest and the slowest cultivators in entering this world was several decades longer than the time it took for this world to enter this world. If it were an ordinary mortal, such a difference in time would naturally be unacceptable. However, for these six tribulation experts, such a difference was nothing at all. After all, for six tribulation experts, millions of years might pass in a moment of rest or nap. In comparison, dozens of years were not much different from an instant. This world was naturally completely different from the one that the middle-aged woman had entered. After all, it had already experienced billions of reincarnations, so how could there still be traces of the past? If the middle-aged woman saw this world again, she would only feel that it was a completely unfamiliar world. It was a world that she had never been to or even heard of before. Compared to the past, this world was much more natural. The cultivation system, the structure of civilization, the distribution of cultivators, and so on in this world still had traces of the middle-aged woman's prison island. Similarly, there were traces of Luo Fan's influence. After all, this world was originally sublimated and transformed from a certain dimension that Luo Fan had opened up on the prison island. Naturally, it was affected by the prison island and also by Luo Fan. With their traces, it wasn't strange at all. However, after experiencing an unknown number of reincarnations, the traces left behind by the two of them had already been completely erased by the countless cycles of life and death. At that moment, the world seemed extremely natural. Every structure, environment, landscape, and even the cultivation system, the distribution of civilizations, and the distribution of cultivators could no longer be found. There were no longer any traces of what it was like in the past. Everything was developed in accordance with the laws of this world and in accordance with the great Tao of this world. Even if it was analyzed millions of times, no traces of other forces could be found. It could be said that even compared to the perfect world and the large world in the state of chaos, this world was more natural and more real. After all, the perfect heaven and earth and the grand heaven and earth were created by a true saint, and they also contained the influence of a true saint. Unless the true saint who created the perfect heaven and earth consciously kept the heaven and earth natural and eliminated all his influence would definitely exist in the perfect heaven and earth. As for the grand heaven and earth, it was just a transformation from the perfect heaven and earth. Naturally, the influence of the perfect heaven and earth would still remain in the grand heaven and earth. Obviously, the world in front of them was completely different. Perhaps there were traces of Luo Fan in this world at the very beginning. But now, after millions and millions of reincarnations, those traces had already disappeared without a trace. It could be said that the current world was more independent and more natural than any other world in the world. It was precisely because this world was so natural and real that the cultivators couldn't find any information about the creator of this world that they wanted to find from this world. After all, no matter how they searched, they could only discover the things that this world should have and should have existed in the first place. They couldn't find any traces of the creator of this world at all. Under such circumstances, it was naturally impossible to find the information that they wanted to find. When the last cultivator stepped into this world, the six tribulation powerhouses gathered together again and began to discuss what they should do. Although, after several decades, the first six tribulation expert to step into this world had already established a foundation in this world and possessed a huge force in this world. The first six tribulation expert to step into this world had already established a foundation in this world. However, such a force was obviously not very useful for the information that they wanted to find. Therefore, the real exploration only began at this time. The methods of these six tribulation powerhouses were naturally extremely brilliant. When they truly explored this world, there is no need to mention how brilliant their methods were and how imposing their aura was. In almost an extremely short period of time, they completely grasped everything in this world. The entire world civilization, be it the cultivation civilization or the secular civilization, was completely disrupted in this process. The entire world seemed to have directly turned into a huge laboratory. Everything existed for the six tribulation powerhouses to explore the secrets of this world. Perhaps the six tribulation powerhouses couldn't stay in this world for too long. After all, it was difficult for them to be sure what would happen outside while they were in this world. Would there be other experts who would directly destroy this world? However, when almost all the powerhouses who were watching in the surroundings stepped into this world, the situation was different. They no longer needed to worry about powerhouses destroying this world. In this way, they could naturally stay in this world with peace of mind. Therefore, this time, they didn't leave this world early. Instead, they continued to explore this world. Even when the reincarnation cycle of life and death appeared, they still stayed in this world and waited for the reincarnation cycle to appear. If a cultivator born in this world faced this reincarnation cycle of life and death, they naturally could only choose to die. After all, it was extremely difficult to obtain the strength to resist a disaster like the reincarnation cycle of life and death. However, to these six tribulation powerhouses, it was just the reincarnation cycle of life and death. How could it be a threat to them? Naturally, they easily passed through the destruction of the world and welcomed the rebirth of the world. However, after welcoming the rebirth of the world, they realized that the situation was extremely different from what they had imagined. After the rebirth of this world, it wasn't just a reconstruction, a redistribution, and a rearrangement like what they had imagined. Chapter 3061. This world had obviously undergone some subtle changes after its rebirth. The rejection and wariness of the entire world towards the six tribulation experts had actually completely disappeared. The entire world had actually completely accepted them after its rebirth, directly treating them as a part of this world. All the rules and laws of the entire world, all matter, energy, and even everything else had actually incorporated the six tribulation experts into the overall system. Their existence had actually affected the energy composition, rule structure, space structure, time structure, karma cycle, fate flow, existence characteristics, and even the form of living beings' cultivation system, and so on and so forth. In such a world, they felt as if they were in the world from which they were born. They even felt more comfortable, happier, and more intimate than in the world from which they were born. If they hadn't seen the situation of this world before its rebirth, they might have even suspected whether this world was the one they had explored before. Does this world have no personality? A six tribulation expert couldn't help but say this to the other experts in disbelief as he looked at the incredible changes in this world. How can we explore such a world? Another expert said helplessly. His words received the agreement of many other experts. After all, in such a world without personality, whatever you added to it would become the same. The power you used to explore the world actually became the basic composition of this power after a reincarnation of the world's birth and death, and directly integrated with the world. It could be said that every exploration in such a world was equivalent to a change in this world. Even if the results of the exploration came out, when the results came out, it also meant that this world had undergone a huge change, which meant that the results of the exploration were already outdated. How could one explore such a world? Make preparations beforehand? Take into consideration the changes that might occur in this world due to the exploration power? This sounded easy, but in fact, it was almost an impossible task. After all, if one wanted to figure out what kind of changes would occur in this world due to the exploration power, one must have an extremely deep understanding of the nature of this world. Only with a deep understanding of the nature of this world could one determine what kind of changes would occur in this world due to certain exploration power. It was like the result of a number being multiplied by a certain number. One naturally needed to know what the number was before one could be sure. If you don't even know the initial number, how can you get the result when you're sure of the number multiplied by it? At this time, the essence of this world was that number. This number was also the answer they wanted to obtain in the end. However, in order to obtain this answer, they had to first know the answer to be able to accurately obtain the final result. This was clearly a paradox. Solving paradoxes wasn't something new for a sixth tribulation powerhouse. However, this does not represent the present paradox. The paradoxes that they could solve were paradoxes that could be solved at a higher, deeper level, or from a certain point of view that conformed to the logic in their cognition. The paradox that the world was encountering now was obviously not within the scope of logical description that they had previously understood. Therefore, it was very difficult for them to solve such a paradox at this time. Of course, all the six tribulation experts believed that this paradox was logical and explainable from a certain point of view. After all, there was no such thing as a question without an answer. No matter how ridiculous the question was, there must be an answer. If you can't find the answer, it's just a matter of your ability. However, although they were certain of this, they couldn't find the answer from that point of view. It was impossible for them to easily obtain the explanation just because they firmly believed that they would definitely be able to find it. While many powerhouses were at a loss, this world began to evolve continuously. The entire world became more and more perfect, more and more stable, and more vibrant. In just a short span of hundreds of thousands of years, the entire world had already developed to the stage when they first stepped into this world. In other words, it had reached an extremely prosperous and flourishing stage. The number of intelligent creatures in this world had reached the level of hundreds of trillions. As for the cultivation civilization, although it was unable to develop existences at the level of tribulation passing and tribulation realm powerhouses, there were too many existences at the level of false saints. However, having reached this step, it was also the critical juncture where it would decline from its peak. In a previous reincarnation, many six tribulation powerhouses did not pay attention to the development of this world. They allowed this world to naturally decline and gradually decline. However, this time, after discovering that this world had no personality and would turn all the external forces and external influences that this world had accepted in the previous reincarnation into a part of the basic composition of this world, even if they had yet to find a way to explain this deadlock, they knew that they could not allow this world to continue this cycle of life and death again and again. Therefore, when this world was at the juncture of extreme prosperity and decline, they finally made up their minds to no longer stay out of it. Instead, they began to participate in the development of this world. With their rich experience and supreme power, they began to eliminate the various hidden dangers that existed in the four segments of Hisi. The strength of these six tribulation powerhouses was naturally insignificant compared to seven tribulation powerhouses like Luo Fan. However, there was no doubt that their methods were brilliant and their strength was powerful. It could be said that as long as any one of them was willing, they only needed to leak out a tiny bit of their strength to completely overturn the billions of worlds. There are currently tens of thousands of such existences in this world. With so many powerful existences, it would be as easy as flipping one's hand for them to solve the hidden dangers of this world's decline. Very soon, the instability of the laws of this world, the instability of the structure of time and space, the entanglement of endless cause and effect, the accumulated resentment, malevolent aura, karma since the birth of this world, and so on and so forth. Everything was naturally sorted out very easily. The hidden dangers began to gradually disappear as time passed. The entire world began to build one peak after another above its peak, pushing the entire world to continuously climb and sublimate towards one peak after another. As the world climbed to one peak after another, the level of the cultivators in this world also rose again and again. At the beginning, they were only at the false sage level, but they eventually developed to the supreme emperor level. They reached a level where they were only a step away from entering the tribulation stage. In fact, this limit only existed because this was only a world and not a truly perfect world. If there were no such restrictions, those peak experts would probably be able to easily break through the limit and become experts in the tribulation stage. As for other restrictions, these six tribulation experts had ways to solve them. However, these six tribulation experts had no way to deal with the restrictions of this world's nature. If they insisted on solving it, They could only send these experts out of this world and into the path of Tao Master. However, such an action was obviously not useful for their purpose. After all, they hadn't stayed in this world for such a long time for the sake of providing warmth and fortuitous encounters to the native experts. They'd stayed here for the sake of figuring out how special this world was and the profundities of this island. In order to achieve this goal, they could spend hundreds of millions of years and even exhaust endless energy. However, if it had nothing to do with this goal, even if it was just a small effort, they would be too lazy to do it. Obviously, giving those powerhouses a chance to improve was an action that would not help them achieve their goals. In this way, there was no need to say what their choice would be. It's already been 300 billion years. On this day, many of the 6 tribulation experts gathered together again. One of them sighed and said to the others, "Staying in this world for such a long time was something they had never imagined before." In fact, during this process, many experts had the idea of giving up. After all, this was just an exploration of the abnormal island. It was not certain what kind of answer they would get in the end and what kind of harvest they would get. Perhaps in the end, they would be able to comprehend an incredible truth and obtain an incredible harvest. In this case, it was naturally worth it to spend so much energy and so much time. However, if the result was an insignificant answer, one that had nothing to do with them at all, one that they could not use at all and could not even get any benefits from, then wouldn't it be a complete waste of their time and energy? However, those experts who wanted to give up were forcibly persuaded by those who were unwilling to give up. After all, they entered this world at the same time, and their influence on this world was also exerted at the same time. If some experts left during this process, then wouldn't their influence on this world change? At that time, would this world change because of this? They had spent so many hundreds of millions of years of effort before. Would it be for naught, even if they did not really obtain any valuable results? Obviously, no 6 tribulation expert would think that their previous hundreds of millions of years of effort was for naught. In their hearts, all of them were certain that they had already obtained a lot of benefits. The reason why it seemed as if they had not obtained any benefits was because these benefits were still lacking something crucial, so there was no real qualitative change. In this way, all of their gains would be for naught, and all of their efforts would be for naught. How could they be willing to do something like that? Therefore, those experts who were unwilling to give up would naturally persuade those who wanted to give up to stay. If it was when they had just stepped into this world, such persuasion naturally would not have been of much use. After all, those experts did not have much of a relationship with each other before this. If you asked them to help, bear with it, and not let everyone's efforts go to waste, why would those experts listen to you? They were not very familiar with each other. But now, after countless hundreds of millions of years, the situation was obviously completely different. Although this world was vast, it was ultimately just a world. Compared to the many 6 tribulation experts, this world, no matter how big it was just like a small village in a small village. With so many 6 tribulation experts constantly seeing each other, it did not take tens of thousands of years for them to naturally become very familiar with each other. When this length of time was calculated in hundreds of millions of years, even if the 6 tribulation experts had different personalities, they would definitely have an extremely deep friendship with each other. With such a friendship, the power of this kind of persuasion was obviously quite powerful. In any case, the flow of time in this world was very different from the flow of time in the outside world. Even if it was hundreds of billions of years in this world, compared to the outside world, it was only a few breaths, at most a few dozen breaths. 4-6 tribulation powerhouses like them. The marks left by time on their bodies and hearts were rather shallow. Therefore, in the face of this kind of persuasion, in the face of this friendship that had been accumulated for who knew how many hundreds of millions of years, those experts who wanted to leave obviously could not bring themselves to do so. In this way, you pull me, I pull him. In the end, these 6 tribulation experts had stayed in this world for hundreds of billions of years in an extremely unbelievable manner. I didn't expect that it would actually be so long. Another expert sighed. Everyone looked at each other, not knowing what to say for a moment. Occasionally, When they thought about this matter, they felt that it was a little ridiculous. For the sake of that worthless answer, they had wasted so much time in this world. If this had not happened to them, they would definitely have despised this matter. However, now that this had happened to them, and it had happened unknowingly, they did not know what kind of attitude they should have for a moment. Why don't we give up? A sixth tribulation expert once again brought out a proposal that had been suppressed for a long time. However, this proposal was met with silence. All the sixth tribulation experts showed a faintly discernible reluctance on their faces. Chapter 3062. From the looks of it, giving up on exploring the secrets of this world and the secrets of this island, leaving hand in hand and ignoring everything here was clearly a rather rational choice. However, this rational choice was obviously not the case for the many sixth tribulation powerhouses. If they made this rational choice, what would it mean for them? It meant that all of them admitted that there was nothing they could do about this world and this island. It meant that all of them admitted that their previous 300 billion years had been a waste of effort. Everything they had done to explore the secrets of this world was also a waste of effort. Obviously, even for an ordinary person, it was not an easy thing to admit these things. Not to mention these six tribulation powerhouses who had always thought that they were omnipotent. Therefore, at this moment, all the six tribulation powerhouses clearly knew that this suggestion of giving up was rational. It was the most appropriate suggestion in this situation. However, none of them were willing to follow this suggestion. At this moment, it was obvious what this suggestion would achieve. The powerhouse who made the suggestion was actually extremely unwilling. If the other powerhouses really agreed to his suggestion and were willing to give up everything they had done in this world, he himself might have raised an objection. At this moment, the other six tribulation powerhouses objected to this suggestion one by one, so he naturally did not insist on it. After such a suggestion and objection, all the six tribulation powerhouses could be said to have unified their opinions. For a moment, the atmosphere returned to its original positive state. All the six tribulation powerhouses had their own thoughts and speculations about this world. Although none of them could really explain the secrets behind this world, such as why this island was so special and different from all the other islands in this void layer, they all had their own speculations about this world. However, all of them had their own guesses, even if they did not have any evidence to support them. Therefore, after knowing that the other six tribulation powerhouses did not have any evidence to prove their speculations, they lost interest in cooperating with each other to explore. After talking about it for a while, they naturally dispersed and went back to their own places. This world originally only had a lifespan of 10 billion years at most before falling into the next cycle of life and death. Now, because of the existence of these six tribulation powerhouses, the existence of this world had been forcibly extended to more than 300 billion years. Because of this world also gave birth to countless phenomena and things that had never appeared in the previous cycle of life and death. For example, there were species of life that had never appeared before, types of energy that had never appeared before, special rules that could not truly take shape due to the short amount of time, various mysterious karmic connections, and so on. It made this world more and more distinct from the previous cycle of life and death. In fact, it was precisely because this world constantly gave birth to things that had never appeared before that the many six tribulation powerhouses had such strong confidence in exploring the secrets of this world. Even after such a long time without any results, they were still so confident that they would be able to obtain the final result. After all, this world was giving birth to more and more things that had never appeared before, which meant that everything they had done in this world was not completely in vain. In this case, if they did something that could reveal the secrets of this world and this island, perhaps all the secrets in this world would be completely revealed before their eyes. In that case, if they were to do something that could reveal the secrets of this world and this island, perhaps all the secrets would be completely revealed before their eyes. In this case, if they did something that could reveal the secrets of this world and the secrets of this island, perhaps all the secrets would be completely revealed before their eyes. By this time, the appearance of this world had changed greatly from the beginning. There is a world of difference between this world and the world of the samsara of life and death in the past. On the surface, this world was tens of thousands of times more prosperous than before. It could be said that almost all the usable space in the entire world had been developed by living beings. The places that were originally barren were now filled with endless living beings. Even the places that were originally forbidden areas for living beings, where living beings would die if they stayed there for an extra breath, were now filled with living beings. At a glance, the entire world was densely packed with life. It was extremely vigorous, and even existences with poor perception could clearly sense it. And this was only on the surface. On a deeper level, there were countless different spaces and small worlds embedded in this world. It was also filled with endless vitality, with innumerable living beings living within. If all the hidden spaces and small worlds were to be unfolded, the number of living beings on the surface of this world would be at least tens of millions of times more. Such a world was truly prosperous to the extreme. But at the same time, the burden of such a world was also extremely strong. At this moment, all living beings in this world could clearly feel that this world was already unable to bear the burden. If there was no way to change this situation, the entire world might completely collapse at any time. On this day, the many six tribulation powerhouses gathered together again. And this time, it had been hundreds of millions of years since the last gathering. If this continues, this world will directly collapse in at most 10,000 years, a six tribulation powerhouse said to the other powerhouses. They would gather again every few 100 million years to decide if they should give up on continuing the exploration. And the answer was obviously the same every time. The longer it took, the more they had to pay, and the greater the price of giving up. Naturally, it was harder for them to make up their minds. So, unknowingly, they no longer treated this issue as the focus of discussion in every gathering. Instead, they treated this gathering as a meeting that would decide the fate of the entire world. We've already dragged this on for so long. Next, we should decide how this world should go. Another six tribulation powerhouse side. I feel that we should continue to eliminate the hidden dangers of this world. Let this world develop naturally. Another six tribulation powerhouse put forward his opinion. If that's the case, this world will collapse. If it collapses, then so be it. Don't you all find this kind of collapse very novel? In the past, have you ever seen the world collapse on its own due to the natural development of nature? Obviously, this kind of collapse definitely contains the secret of this world. So, waiting for this world to collapse might be our best chance to figure out this world's secret. The six tribulation powerhouse who suggested waiting said with some anticipation. However, this is only your guess. Although the collapse of this world is rare, it's just another manifestation of the cycle of life and death. Perhaps this kind of collapse will at most start the next cycle of life and death. Another six tribulation powerhouse poured a bucket of cold water on the other party. This world continued to develop under the condition that they did their best to eliminate all hidden dangers. The current state of this world being overwhelmed was actually the result of their greatest efforts. In the process of this world's development, they had actually thought of all ways to reduce the pressure the living beings of this world had on the world. Not only did they think of all ways to reduce the number of living beings, they even opened up countless small worlds and alternate spaces for this world to bear the many living beings. Unfortunately, all of these methods seemed so powerless in the face of the natural development of this world. As the world's civilization and cultivation developed, their resistance to all kinds of methods to reduce the number of living beings became stronger and stronger. Unless the six tribulation powerhouses directly wiped out all living beings with their own strength, no matter what they did, they would not be able to affect the number of living beings on a large scale in the face of the world civilization and the cultivation civilization of this world. Directly eliminating the living beings of this world on a large scale was actually not something that those six tribulation powerhouses felt any psychological pressure. If this was really effective, they would not be stingy with it. A six-tribulation powerhouse could create countless worlds and space-time with just a slight thought. With just a slight thought, these countless worlds and space-time would be completely erased. How could such an existence feel any psychological pressure when it slaughtered living beings? However, it was very clear that things were not that simple. In this cycle of life and death, they had already been completely accepted by this world. To this world, they were a part of this world. They were part of the reason why this world was like this. Under such circumstances, their every move would not only affect the outcome on the surface, but also affect the root of the entire world on a deeper level. In other words, if they were to eliminate living beings on a large scale, it would mean that part of the world's root had begun to eliminate the living beings of this world. When that time came, the direction of the entire world would change, and the entire world's power would participate in this kind of elimination. When that time came, all the living beings of this world might be completely erased. Once all living beings were completely erased, this world would directly enter doomsday and begin the next cycle of life and death. If this really happened, then wouldn't their previous efforts of trillions of years be completely in vain? Therefore, even if those six tribulation powerhouses had the ability to eliminate living beings on a large scale to solve the problem of this world being overburdened, they did not dare to do so. Of course, there was another way to eliminate living beings on a large scale. That was to expand this world and create countless alternate spaces and countless small worlds for this world. This way, the living beings that this world could not withstand would be included in those alternate spaces and live in those small worlds. Eliminating living beings could be regarded as saving money, while opening up more small worlds and more spaces could be regarded as increasing the source of income. Since they did not believe in saving money, the only option was to increase the source of income as much as possible. It could be said that if this world was a perfect world, using this method of increasing the source of income could be said to be no problem at all. It would definitely be able to perfectly solve the problem of living beings. This was because the number of small worlds and alternate spaces that a perfect world could accommodate was almost infinite. Even if there were billions or trillions of times more living beings in this world, it would only be a matter of a few more spaces and a few more small worlds. However, it was obvious that this was just a world and not a perfect world. Since it was a world, there was naturally a limit to how much it could accommodate for existences like alternate spaces and small worlds. After all, even though those alternate dimensions and small worlds couldn't compare to this world in every aspect, their levels weren't that much different from this world. If this world was compared to a planet, then the small worlds and alternate spaces were things like rocks. In terms of their level, this comparison was actually quite appropriate. Although the small worlds and alternate spaces were far inferior to this world in all aspects, in essence, there was actually not much difference between them and this world. For example, even if an ordinary planet was countless times larger than a small rock in terms of scale, in essence, a planet could actually be a relatively large rock. In contrast, existences like a perfect world and a large world were equivalent to a universe. Obviously, no matter how many rocks were placed in a universe, there was absolutely no problem. However, if the number of rocks on a planet increased to a certain ratio, the planet would obviously be unable to bear it and would definitely lose its orbit. In the end, it might even crash into a star and be completely melted and destroyed. Therefore, it was obviously impossible for this world to bear countless small worlds and alternate spaces that were attached to it forever. Once the number of small worlds and alternate spaces increased to a certain limit, this world would be unable to bear the burden. There was no need to wait for the living beings to exert pressure on this world. Just those small worlds and alternate spaces alone would be enough to crush this world. And now, after billions of years, with the efforts of many six tribulation powerhouses and the development of a strong and healthy civilization in this world, the number of small worlds and alternate spaces attached to this world had already approached the limit that this world could bear. It was precisely because of this that whether it was increasing the source of income or reducing the expenditure, the effect of this world had already reached its limit. Next, unless a third method could be found besides increasing the source of income and reducing the expenditure, the collapse of this world was already destined. Chapter 3063. It wasn't that these six tribulation powerhouses weren't smart enough, nor were they inexperienced. It was just that they had never put so much thought into a world before. To them, they could create countless worlds with a single thought, and they could destroy countless worlds with a single thought. How could they care so much about such a thing? Since they didn't care much about it, they naturally wouldn't spend so much time and effort on research just for the sake of a world's continued existence. It was precisely because of this that they were at a loss as to how to extend the existence of a world in this impossible situation. The only way is to sublimate this world and turn it into a heaven and earth. After a long discussion, a six tribulation powerhouse put forward his idea. This made all the six tribulation powerhouses fall into silence at this moment. Did no one really think of this method? This was obviously impossible. Since it was impossible to maintain this world at this level, it was already impossible for this world to continue existing. Then wouldn't all problems be solved by pulling this world out of the level of a world and pulling it into the level of a heaven and earth? Obviously, this kind of reasoning was almost a matter of course. There wasn't the slightest bit of crooked reasoning. Each of these six tribulation powerhouses had gone through hundreds of millions of years of cultivation before finally achieving their final achievements. There was no need to say much about their brilliant wisdom. How could they not think of such a straight line of reasoning? However, since almost all the six tribulation powerhouses had thought of this, why didn't they say it before? Obviously, it wasn't because they couldn't say it. Rather, they clearly knew what their goal was. They maintained the continued existence of this world and prevented it from falling back into the cycle of life and death. This was obviously only their method, not their goal. Their ultimate goal wasn't to continue the existence of this world, but to figure out the secret behind this world and this island. That world was so conspicuous, and the island had such a strong sense of existence. If they could obtain this secret, even if they had to personally destroy this world, they wouldn't hesitate at all. The reason why they wholeheartedly wanted to maintain this world and prevent it from falling back into a new cycle of life and death was because they thought that doing so would allow them to achieve their ultimate goal. It wasn't that they really wanted this world, and their real goal was to keep this world going. In that case, the choice of turning this world into a world was clearly not within their consideration. After all, the transformation of the world into heaven and earth would be fine if the island itself had evolved. The entire sublimation process would contain a lot of the island's secrets, allowing them to see countless things that they hadn't seen before. However, if they changed the method, and it was not a natural evolution of the island, but the external six tribulation powerhouses who used their methods to turn the world into a world, the situation would be completely different. In that case, the secrets of this world itself would be completely destroyed because of their actions. At that time, they would not be able to find any of the secrets they were looking for in this world. They would be able to trace all the anomalies in this world back to themselves in the end. What meaning did such a result have to them? Was it really just to obtain a world that they could create with a single thought? Therefore, even though many of the six tribulation powerhouses had already thought of this method, no one suggested it. All of the six tribulation powerhouses acted as if they hadn't thought of this method. They just kept searching for solutions within their original limits. This method isn't appropriate, a six tribulation powerhouse said indifferently to that powerhouse's suggestion. As for why it wasn't appropriate, he didn't say much because he believed that all the six tribulation powerhouses should be extremely clear about this. There was no need for him to say anything. I naturally know what everyone is thinking, the powerhouse who suggested this method said at this moment. His words caused the expressions of those powerhouses to freeze slightly. Their eyes revealed an indescribable look of anticipation. They had previously thought that this person had completely run out of ideas, so he suggested this method as a last resort. That was why they were disdainful of this method. However, what if this sixth tribulation powerhouse wasn't trying everything as a last resort? What if he had actually thought through everything clearly during this process? If that was really the case, perhaps he had considerations that they hadn't thought of. Perhaps this method might have a meaning that they hadn't thought of. Because of this, these six tribulation powerhouses were filled with anticipation at this moment. The sixth tribulation powerhouse said at this moment, however, regardless of whether you admit it or not, if we continue like this, even if this world can be maintained, the possibility of us getting the final answer is very small. Hearing this, the expressions of the other six tribulation powerhouses became somewhat ugly. Although they were unwilling to admit it, they had actually vaguely realized this. It was just that they were unwilling to admit it because they were unwilling to accept it. The sixth tribulation powerhouse also didn't intend to let the others admit their hidden thoughts. At this moment, he continued, since we won't be able to change our current predicament even if we continue like this, why don't we just change our fate? Perhaps change was futile. Compared to now, there was actually no difference. However, what if change can bring about a breakthrough? In that case, the situation will be much better than now. I think everyone should be clear on this. His words caused the other six tribulation powerhouses to show a look of realization. Indeed, the situation had already reached this stage. How bad could it get? Moreover, everyone might have forgotten something. We have actually been completely accepted by this world. Are all our actions really any different from the world's spontaneous evolution? The last sentence of the sixth tribulation powerhouse completely moved the hearts of the six tribulation powerhouses. Indeed, their many actions in this world were, in all seriousness, not much different from the transformation of this world into a world. They both caused the world to undergo earth-shattering changes and overturn the original appearance of this world. However, all this while, their actions didn't seem to be stopped by the creator behind this world. This world, or rather, the existence behind this island, seemed to completely ignore them, allowing them to do whatever they wanted in this world. As a result, this world went from falling into the cycle of life and death for billions of years, at most tens of billions of years, to not falling into the next cycle of life and death, even after 1 trillion years. Compared to the transformation of this world into a world, was there really an intrinsic difference? However, the existence behind this world ignored all these changes and directly allowed them to make such changes to this world. Thinking of this, most of the six tribulation powerhouses were already convinced. All right, then let's give it a try. A six tribulation powerhouse said. Most of the other six tribulation powerhouses had solemn expressions at this moment. They either nodded, were expressionless, or were deep in thought. However, none of them raised any objections. At this step, the thoughts of all the six tribulation powerhouses could be said to have been unified. What to do next was no longer a problem for these six tribulation powerhouses. Transforming a world into a world was not a difficult thing for them. At least, compared to saving a world from the fate of certain death, transforming a world into a world was many times easier. Saving a world from the fate of certain death was equivalent to hatching a chicken from an egg that couldn't possibly hatch a chicken. Transforming a world into a world was equivalent to turning the egg into a sun egg, a poached egg, or an auspicious egg. Obviously, even though the latter seemed more advanced and seemed to be able to turn the egg into something extremely advanced, the difficulty was obviously countless times lower than the former. The latter could be done as long as one's culinary skills were sufficient. The former required heaven-defying abilities to be able to do it. At this moment, since they had already unified their opinions, things were extremely easy. Immediately, many six tribulation powerhouses went to various parts of the world. Powerful wills were directly released from their bodies and began to sweep across the entire world. After their wills came into contact with each other, they changed directions and directed their wills towards the depths of space-time. They began to completely control all the layers and sides of this world from the inside out. They had done too many things in order to continue maintaining this world. Now, almost all the layers and sides of this world were covered with their traces. At this moment, When their wills were carried out, they instantly strung these countless traces together. All the traces were instantly controlled by them again. With these countless traces covering all the layers and sides of this world, if they wanted to change this world, it would be much easier than they had imagined. Transforming a world into a world was naturally not too simple. Even if it wasn't difficult in the eyes of these 6 tribulation powerhouses, it was only because they were 6 tribulation powerhouses. In reality, if one did not possess a certain level of strength, it would be impossible to achieve this. Previously, many 6 tribulation powerhouses had spoken of it easily, but none of them had taken it lightly. At this moment, after they controlled all the layers and sides of the world, they began to exchange countless information with each other. What to do next, what they were responsible for, what the other party was responsible for, how to cooperate with each other, how to rebuild the order after destroying the world, how to rebuild the rules, and so on. All of this was quickly discussed by them during this process. Although there were so many things that they had agreed on, there were still 6 tribulation powerhouses after all. The time they actually spent discussing was less than a few breaths. Very soon, all the details were completely confirmed by them. As they confirmed all the details, they began to take action. In an instant, all the 6 tribulation powerhouses exerted their strength at the same time. The entire world instantly came to a standstill. The entire world's time was completely paused at this moment. All living beings in this world, unless they were powerful enough to reach the 6 tribulation powerhouse level, were completely unable to resist the effect of time pausing. Soon after, the world collapsed. The laws of the entire world, matter, energy, time, space, illusion, reality, karma, fate, and everything else completely disintegrated in this process. In the blink of an eye, the world that was originally extremely orderly directly turned into a mess that was like a paste. Following this change, many 6 tribulation powerhouses began to move quickly. The laws of the entire world, matter, energy, time, space, illusion, reality, everything was quickly rebuilt by their means. Very soon, everything became clear again. Order was reestablished. The various things that had previously become chaotic seemed to have been given a new order at this moment. They appeared in this world according to a brand new structure. Of course, at this moment, the appearance of this world had also completely changed. It looked many times vaster than before. Time was also much more stable. The stability of space had also reached an unimaginable level. The embryonic form has been established. As for how to perfect it next, it will depend on this island. At this moment, many 6 tribulation powerhouses had similar thoughts. At this moment, this world was actually no longer a world. Of course, it was still not a heaven and earth. The current world could actually be considered the embryonic form of the heaven and earth. Although it still wasn't a heaven and earth, the general outline of the heaven and earth had already been constructed. Next, they only needed to wait for the embryonic form of the heaven and earth to continuously evolve and perfect, allowing the embryonic form to grow into a true heaven and earth. The reason for this was naturally because the many 6 tribulation powerhouses who had transformed this world into a heaven and earth were experts who walked the righteous path. Such experts could construct a world that was no weaker than the heaven and earth. However, they lacked the ability to construct a heaven and earth. After all, their worldview wasn't complete. Even if they gathered all the ideas of the 6 tribulation powerhouses, compared to any crude worldview, there would still be some flaws that couldn't be ignored. Chapter 3064. As a result, it was clearly impossible for these 6 tribulation experts to construct a world out of thin air. Of course, this kind of construction referred to the construction that completely controlled every detail of the world, every rule, every space, every cause and effect, and many other details. This was fundamentally different from creating a world at will. This kind of construction that controlled some details was like the world created by the creators of the world in Luo Fan's 7 Tribulation. It was the kind of world that the creator had absolute control over. Everything in the world was no secret to the creator. However, it was obviously different to create a world at will. The creator of a world might not be able to control it at all, and might not even know the specific situation of the world. The world that the six tribulation experts could not create was the first kind of world that they had complete control over. But now, the world that they wanted to create was obviously not this kind of world. It was not only because of the limitations of their own abilities, but also because there were too many six tribulation experts here. So many six tribulation experts had to participate in the creation of this world. If the created world could be completely controlled by someone, then who would control it? Therefore, not to mention the fact that they couldn't do it, even if they had the ability to do it, they wouldn't use such a method to construct the world. Of course, it was very obvious that although they could not directly create a world that they had absolute control over, it did not mean that the six tribulation experts could not create a world. Although it was at least one level higher than the world, for the six tribulation experts who could use a world that was one level lower than the world to dominate most of the worlds. How could they not use indirect methods to create a world? Now, what these six tribulation experts were doing was obviously using indirect methods to create a world. What these six tribulation experts did was to first build the embryonic form of the world, and then give this embryonic form the ability to evolve and sublimate itself. Through this ability, this embryonic form would evolve and sublimate itself. Many related factors that the six tribulation experts could not give to this world could be perfected through its own evolution. In this way, the weakness of the six tribulation experts' huge lack of understanding of the world was naturally bypassed, and the world was formed. Of course, after this self-evolution and self-sublimation, the relationship between this world and the six tribulation experts became distant. After this world was finally formed, there would definitely be a lot of secrets that these six tribulation experts didn't know about. The six tribulation experts could influence many of the factors that they knew of to a certain extent. However, for those secrets that they did not know, they had clearly become rather powerless. This was fundamentally different from a world created by an expert who walked the path of the opposite direction. Because the foundation of the world created by the existence who walked the path of retrogression was already perfect, even if the world underwent a certain amount of evolution and sublimation, the fundamental change would not be too great. In that case, the creator of the world would be able to control the entire world through the foundation. Of course, since the essence had been determined, the level of the world was naturally determined as well. Thus, if a cultivator who walked the path of retrogression opened up a world that they could completely control, the level of the world would generally not exceed the level of their own worldview. In comparison, cultivators who walked the path of righteousness were different. Although it was difficult for cultivators who walked the path of righteousness to open up a world that they could completely control, because the foundation of the world they opened up was unstable, in the end, it would evolve and sublimate itself into something like nirvana. Naturally, it was also uncertain. In this way, there might be a chance that the world would eventually evolve and sublimate to a level that surpassed the level of the cultivator themselves. From this perspective, the path of righteousness and the path of retrogression actually had their own advantages and weaknesses. It was difficult to say which was superior. At this time, the many six tribulation experts had already stopped. They quietly watched the embryonic world continue to evolve and sublimate, gradually turning into a complete world. At this time, from the outside, the island suddenly radiated an unimaginably bright light. The whole world seemed to have turned into a fountain, madly spraying some kind of indescribable existence around. And this kind of sputtering attracted the surrounding void in another direction. There were innumerable similar existences crazily pouring into the island, forming an indescribable cycle. Such a change caused the island to be more than 100 times more conspicuous than before. Its incomparably strong sense of existence even drew the attention of the cultivators who did not sweep their perception in this direction involuntarily. How can an island have such a strong sense of existence? An indescribable surprise emerged in the hearts of the six tribulation experts. Except for a few six tribulation experts who had recently ascended, Almost all the six tribulation experts had spent hundreds of millions of years on the sixth level of the Town Master's path. In fact, the cultivators who had stayed here for the longest period of time could only be calculated in billions of trillions of years. Under such circumstances, the many six tribulation experts naturally did not think that their understanding of the sixth level of the Town Master's path was shallow. Even those six tribulation experts who had only stayed for hundreds of millions of years thought that they had a very deep understanding of the entire sixth level of the Town Master's path. They did not dare to say that they had not grasped its essence, but they thought that they had seen all kinds of phenomena that might appear in the sixth level of the Town Master's path. It was because of this understanding that they were so shocked and even lost their cool when they suddenly saw that the island built by Luo Fan had such an unimaginable sense of existence. In the past, only some six tribulation experts who were closer and more curious wanted to explore this island. But now, with the incredible sense of existence of this island, the range of six tribulation experts who had such thoughts had obviously expanded by more than 100 times. Although those six tribulation experts had already stayed on that island for over 1 trillion years, the six tribulation experts were still able to enter the island. However, in reality, compared to the outside world, it had only been less than an hour since they disappeared from the island. Such a short period of time might be considered a long time in a battle, but for those cultivators who had been accumulating for hundreds of millions of years to improve their cultivation realm, this amount of time was obviously not even necessary to describe. However, although they had only been in for less than an hour, the surroundings of the island were no longer as empty as when they entered. At that time, all the six tribulation powerhouses had already entered the island, or rather, that world. However, in less than an hour, a large number of six tribulation experts gathered from all over the place and appeared around the island, trying to find ways to explore the secrets of this island. At this time, the sudden change of the island made them bear the brunt of it and directly felt the shock brought about by the sudden increase in the sense of existence. What are they doing inside? At this time, a six tribulation expert could not help but roar. This island obviously could not have appeared out of thin air, so the sense of existence suddenly increased. Someone inside the island must have done something to cause such a change. And obviously, the ones who were most likely to do something were the six tribulation experts who had entered the island before. Realizing this, they were secretly dissatisfied with the six tribulation experts who had entered before. You guys went to explore the secrets of the island. How did you guys become part of the island's secrets in less than an hour? You guys want to spy on the secrets, not to work. At this time, the surrounding layer of nothingness kept twisting and changing. Then, figures from various places and layers kept appearing around Shu through various methods. With just a sniff, the number of six tribulation experts in the surroundings increased by more than 10 times. Moreover, this multiplier was still increasing. For a moment, it was impossible to see where the limit was. A few minutes later, the number of six tribulation experts there had already exceeded 1 million. These six tribulation experts stayed around in various ways. Looking from a distance, it was as if this island was surrounded by a faint mist. Among these six tribulation experts who had gathered, there were many disciples of Tao Masters. Compared with the previous few layers of the Road of Tao Master, the relationship between the disciples of Tao Masters and the rogue cultivators on the sixth layer of the Road of Tao Master was much better, but after all, there was still a fundamental difference between them. Although the relationship had eased, they were still playing in different circles. Under normal circumstances, rogue cultivators rarely went to areas with many disciples of Tao Masters. Similarly, the disciples of Tao Masters rarely went to areas with many rogue cultivators. A situation like this, where a large number of rogue cultivators and disciples of Tao Masters mingled together, was extremely rare in the history of the sixth layer of the Road of Tao Master. Once the number of cultivators increased, there would naturally be many who had friendly relations. In this way, after a series of inquiries and exchanges, almost all the cultivators had an understanding of the situation of this island. Of course, Their current unified understanding was that none of them knew much about the specific situation of this island. It's just a waste of time to watch here. We have to go in to get secrets. A Sixth Tribulation expert said this, then rushed into the island with those who had friendly relations with them. They directly entered the first layer of the world, or rather, the first layer of the world. There were many Sixth Tribulation experts who had made similar judgments. Some of them roughly stated their decisions, while others did not even say a word and entered the island with the cultivators who had friendly relations with them. The Sixth Tribulation experts behind naturally had their own judgments. Some of them also believed that they had to enter the island in order to get the final secret. However, because they did not know what kind of danger might be inside the island, they would rather wait for the experts in front to decide what to do next. However, the development of the situation was extremely unbelievable for those experts who had planned to wait and see. That was because the more experts that entered the island, the stronger the island's presence became. It felt as if the island had directly swallowed the existence of those Sixth Tribulation experts. This situation made those cautious Sixth Tribulation experts even more vigilant. This kind of strange situation did not seem right no matter how they looked at it. I think we should be more careful and wait and see. A cultivator said to his companions. Hearing this, his companions nodded. It was clear that birds of a feather flocked together. Cultivators who could get along with each other had similar personalities. As time passed, the cultivators with different opinions gradually divided into two camps. A large number of cultivators who were willing to take risks entered the island, while a large number of cultivators who were cautious and unwilling to take risks stayed outside. As time passed, the proportion of cultivators who remained outside became more and more cautious and unwilling to take risks. As this proportion increased, the atmosphere around the island also changed subtly. Because of this atmosphere, the danger level of the island continued to increase for those who came later. As the danger level increased, their decisions naturally began to change. Originally, they wanted to directly rush into the island to explore the secrets of the island. However, influenced by the atmosphere around the island, they unknowingly made the decision to stay and watch, waiting for those who came before them to enter. As a result, the number of cultivators around the island did not decrease as time passed. Instead, it increased. Looking from afar, the thin mist shrouding the island was getting thicker and thicker. The existence of this mist did not reduce the existence of the island. Instead, it made the existence of the island even more intense. After all, although they looked like cultivators from afar, those Sixth Tribulation experts also had a powerful presence. Although their presence did not directly merge with the island, just their presence around the island was enough to greatly increase the presence of the area. Read. La. Chapter 3066. This ranking list included all the Sixth Tribulation powerhouses who had entered this projection, and the ranking criteria was based on the number of times they had caused a drastic change in the world. Ranked first on this ranking list was a name that all the Sixth Tribulation powerhouses in this projection were quite familiar with. It was the name of the old man whom many Sixth Tribulation powerhouses hated and felt was the culprit who caused them to fall into this projection. Moreover, this first place was much higher than the second place. In terms of the number of times they had caused a drastic change in the world, the difference between the first and second place was at least 3 times. With such an advantage, it could be said that he would definitely get a reward. As Sixth Tribulation powerhouses, time could be said to be infinite for them. As long as they wanted to, the time they could stay in this world's illusory world could be unlimited. In this way, if they wanted to determine the ownership of the reward, they naturally couldn't wait until all of them had left this world's illusory shadow to determine it. It was even more impossible to determine the reward after the Sixth Tribulation powerhouses could no longer hold on. If they really used these 2 time points, perhaps no Sixth Tribulation powerhouse will be able to get the benefits that Luo Fan had given them. Taking this into consideration, Luo Fan directly created a countdown on the ranking list. A countdown of millions of years. As soon as the countdown ended, the ranking would be calculated and the reward would be given. Of course, this countdown of millions of years naturally could not be the countdown of the outside world, but was just the countdown of time inside this projection. After all, even if Luo Fan had unlimited time to squander, spending millions of years on this kind of cultivation was too extravagant for him. Moreover, he did not have unlimited time to squander at all. His next great tribulation would only descend in nearly 100 million years. If he really spent all his time studying the Great Tao and the related functions of the nomological law layer for hundreds of millions of years, it could no longer be described as extravagant. That was simply a reckless waste of God's gifts. Fortunately, he could adjust the flow of time in the world of laws at will. He didn't need to experience so much time, but he could let the cultivators who entered the world of laws experience tens of millions of times more time than the outside world. Just like at this moment, even the one with the slowest flow of time was tens of thousands of times faster than the outside world. The flow of time was fast, and the flow of time was hundreds of millions of times faster than that of the outside world. It was just like the world of laws in the layer of nothingness where most of the cultivators stayed. Even though it had not been long since these world of laws had appeared, the world of laws was still in a state of chaos. But in reality, if one were to really count, not to mention one countdown, even 10 countdowns would be enough. At this time, the ranking countdown that Luo Fan listed was only taken from the last 10 million years. As for the results of all the cultivators, they were merely taken from the next 10 million years. To a certain extent, this could be considered a fairly fair ranking, because it was the first time the countdown was about to come to an end. While the 6 tribulation experts were still guessing what the final reward would be, the countdown ended. The ranking was instantly frozen by the golden light, and all the changes stopped. Immediately afterwards, many of the 6 tribulation powerhouses felt their minds suddenly being pulled into a strange void. Here, apart from the other cultivators who were also 6 tribulation experts, there was nothing else. Is this the ranking space? When they fell into this void, the 6 tribulation experts all came to a realization. When they entered, the void directly poured the essence of this space into their hearts in the form of information, allowing them to understand where they were. This place, at least according to the information, was the ranking space. It was a void space attached to the ranking. This space would appear at the end of every countdown of the ranking list. It would pull all the cultivators in the world of laws into this space to conduct a phase calculation, and the distribution of rewards would also appear here. Moreover, in addition to this space also had an extremely wonderful characteristic. That was, it had relaxed the shackles of the 6 tribulation experts by countless times. Originally, the connection between these 6 tribulation experts and their main bodies was completely concealed within the world of laws. In other words, although their main bodies could occasionally confirm that their clones were still alive and were still their clones, they could only sense that. What these avatars had experienced, what they had gained, what they had lost, what they had experienced, what they had experienced, what they had experienced, what they had suffered, what they had experienced, 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 what they had experienced. However, in this ranking space, this restriction had completely disappeared. At this moment, the clones and incarnations of these 6 tribulation experts could reconnect with their true bodies. The communication between the incarnation, the clone, and the true body could be resumed. Following this change, the incarnations and clones of the 6 tribulation experts were both surprised and delighted. What surprised them was that the creator of this world was willing to let go of this restriction so that they could reestablish contact with their true bodies. After all, if the connection was reestablished, then everything he had done to them would be known by their true bodies. At that time, it would be quite troublesome for him if their true bodies were unhappy and came looking for him directly. It would be fine if there was no other way, but since there was a way to conceal the connection between them and their true bodies, it would be impossible for them to reestablish this connection no matter what. That was why they were surprised. Naturally, there was no need to mention their joy. Being able to reestablish contact with their true bodies meant that everything they had experienced, everything they had gained, and everything they had lost would be known by their true bodies. They would also receive the strong support of their true bodies again. Whether their true bodies directly fished them out or directly gave them some support through space, it would be of great help to them. How could they not be happy? In just an instant, they had completed countless exchanges with their true bodies. The various encounters they had in the world of laws were also transmitted to their true bodies at this moment and were clearly received by them. Among them, many six tribulation powerhouses even urged their true bodies to find trouble with the old man who was ranked first. After all, no matter how one looked at it, this trouble was caused by the old man, and the old man had directly obtained the greatest benefits in the process. Although it was only in stages, and the exact extent of the benefits was still unknown, benefits were benefits. After causing trouble, he himself obtained benefits, while others only received trouble. Who would be able to feel at ease? If one were to think of it as a conspiracy, one might even suspect that he had participated in this trouble. In this way, it wasn't strange at all that some six tribulation powerhouses wanted their true bodies to take revenge on the old man's true body. Compared to the various thoughts of the other six tribulation powerhouses, the emotions of the old man, who was ranked first, were even more intense. He didn't care about his own benefits at all. At this moment, he was just complaining in his heart. Originally, the reason why he went through so much trouble and eventually became ranked first was because he wanted to avoid the other six tribulation powerhouses and prevent them from finding trouble with him. However, at this moment, after the countdown ended, they were actually directly pulled into this so-called ranking space. All the six tribulation powerhouses were actually in the same room. This was like sending a sheep to the mouth of tens of thousands of ferocious tigers. Moreover, this ranking space didn't just gather them together, it actually released the shackles between them and their true bodies, allowing them to communicate everything that happened here with their true bodies. This practically didn't just want his incarnation to die, but his true body as well. How could he not complain in his heart? At this moment, the entire void lit up slightly. Then, countless streams of light began to gather in the void. These streams of light swept through all the six tribulation powerhouses here, and vaguely seemed to have some kind of indescribable communication with the cultivation paths in the bodies of the six tribulation powerhouses. Soon after, all the streams of light gathered on the old man's body, diverting the old man's attention from other places to this space, to the reward that was about to arrive. What is this? After these streams of light gathered on his body, the old man felt his heart beating slightly faster. The various cultivation mysteries that were originally hidden in his body became extremely active at this moment. This feeling seemed to be that some kind of existence was choosing these mysteries for cultivation. Very quickly, an inexplicable understanding emerged in his heart. This is letting me choose a mystery. He finally connected the current changes with the information that had been poured into his heart before, and finally understood the function of this stream of light. At this moment, both his true body and this incarnation could not help but feel their hearts beating faster. The most suitable mystery for me to cultivate. Is this really possible? Does he really have this ability? This thought flashed through the old man's mind, causing his expression to become complicated. If it was really as described in the information, then this encounter might be the biggest lucky chance he had ever obtained after stepping into the 6th level of the Town Master's path. Perhaps he could rely on this harvest to directly break through the limit and further his cultivation realm that had reached the peak of the 6th tribulation powerhouse. In that case, the bottleneck of ascension would no longer exist for him, and he could, at any time, ascend to the 7th level of the Town Master's path. And as long as he could do this, then, even if there were really narrow-minded experts among the tens of thousands of 6 tribulation powerhouses around him who went to find trouble with his true body, he would no longer have to worry about anything happening to his true body, of course. This was only a negligible benefit after the improvement of his cultivation realm. Most importantly, if he could ascend, it meant that the originally peaceful cultivation that had been blocking his way would be completely broken by him. He would, once again, have an unimaginably bright future, and would once again have endless space to move forward. However, in the end, he still did not quite believe in this possibility. One had to know that the mysteries of cultivation that any cultivator could grasp could be said to be endless. Any one of these mysteries might be the cultivation mystery that the practitioner was most proficient in. Even if it was an existence that was more powerful than him, it would be unimaginably difficult for him to say that he could choose the mystery to cultivate at will, and that he would show him a higher realm. What's more, at this time, the creator behind this heaven and earth phantom was not only making this claim to a sixth tribulation powerhouse, but also to tens of thousands of experts around him. This difficulty, compared to a sixth tribulation powerhouse, was more than tens of thousands of times more difficult. How could he accept this without any obstacles? However, although he felt that this possibility was not high, if it could really be realized, the benefits were really too great. Therefore, even if there was some doubt in his heart, he did not neglect this choice this time. He did not choose the most difficult and unpopular cultivation, profound mystery, just to test the strength of the creator behind this world's illusory figure. Instead, he directly chose the cultivation mystery that was most important to him, the one that he most needed to improve the most. As he made this choice, the numerous flowing lights slightly condensed, and then their luster began to change. In the blink of an eye, they turned into some kind of indescribable color. With a loud bang, they directly turned into an endless sea of light, directly drowning the entire void. This sea of light seemed to be a void, but the elder could clearly feel that the entire sea of light, the entire void, was resonating with him. Or more specifically, it was resonating with the mystery that he had chosen in his body. Following this resonance, all sorts of indescribable information appeared out of nowhere in his mind. Gradually, he began to analyze the mysteries of cultivation in his mind, causing the mysteries of cultivation to gradually become fragmented in his eyes. However, these words were always fragmented, but it was not a disaster. Instead, it was an indescribable opportunity that allowed him to deepen his understanding of this cultivation mystery. It allowed him to see the direction of this cultivation mystery more and more clearly. At this moment, all of the distracting thoughts in the elder's heart completely disappeared. Only the analysis of the cultivation mystery remained in his heart, and it continuously deepened and grew. Chapter 3067. At this moment, all the sixth tribulation powerhouses in the ranking space felt the indescribable mysteries of cultivation in the streams of light that filled the entire void. The profound mysteries of cultivation were so clear and so grand. Even though their compatibility with the profound mysteries of cultivation was extremely weak, they could clearly feel that the formless and intangible profound mysteries of cultivation in their bodies were becoming active, as if they could absorb some kind of invisible nourishment from the profound mysteries of cultivation in the flowing light. In the blink of an eye, all the six tribulation powerhouses turned their gazes to a certain place in the void, to the location of the old man with the appearance of a sagely old man. Given the current situation, it was easy for them to link this to the reward mentioned in the information that had entered their minds. And obviously, according to the ranking, the reward should be the old man. In that case, it was very likely that the old man was the core of this strange phenomenon. Sure enough, when they saw the old man clearly, they suddenly discovered that an indescribable change had occurred in the old man's body. His entire body seemed to have turned into a black hole, constantly absorbing the streams of light that filled the void around him. This absorption was clearly not directed at the streams of light itself, but it's something indescribable contained within the streams of light. Given the six tribulation powerhouses' perception of the streams of light around them, they instantly knew that what was being absorbed was the mysteries of cultivation that were most suitable for the cultivator ranked first. Crack, crack. Faintly, many of the six tribulation powerhouses could hear this kind of cracking sound coming from the old man's body. It was as if there was something extremely sturdy in his body that was shattering. And with this cracking sound, the old man's aura also uncontrollably leaked out of his body and began to rise, continuously sublimate. It was as if he was about to climb to a higher realm and a stronger peak. Faced with this situation, how could all the six tribulation powerhouses not know that the reward for being ranked first was real, and it was even more precious and beneficial to cultivation than they had imagined? There's actually such a reward. What kind of existence is the person behind this? How could he do such a heaven-defying thing? This thought flashed through the minds of all the six tribulation powerhouses. Indescribable shock and desire instantly replaced all the negative emotions in their hearts. It made them yearn for the start of the next competition. Compared to the shock and desire of the other six tribulation powerhouses, the old man had already devoted himself to the incredible mysteries of cultivation that had appeared out of thin air around him. The mysteries of cultivation that had appeared around him were like the state of a higher realm of the mysteries he had chosen. Just its existence alone was enough to widen his horizons and clear the path ahead. What's more, the mysteries around him weren't just the outlines. The details and mysteries contained within them were 100 times richer than the most perfect state he could imagine. Wrapped in such mysteries, he could almost feel himself breaking through the bottleneck that had shackled him at every moment. His cultivation realm was advancing towards the level of a seventh tribulation powerhouse. Now, the continuous cracking sound that came from his body was none other than the sound of the bottleneck being gradually broken. It was an invisible sound that could only be sensed by the soul. The sound became more and more frequent at this time, which obviously meant that the bottleneck was breaking faster and faster. It could be predicted that as long as the sound continued, it wouldn't take long for the bottleneck to completely collapse, and his cultivation realm would completely step into a new stage. At that time, he would no longer be limited to the sixth level of the Town Master's Road, and he would be qualified to ascend to the seventh level of the Town Master's Road. Once things developed to that point, for him, all the grudges in the sixth level of the Town Master's Road would no longer be of much significance. Unfortunately, just when the cracking sound was almost continuous, the flowing light paused for a moment, and then became more and more illusory. Soon after, it completely disappeared, as if it had never appeared. As the sound disappeared, the various strange things that came from the old man's body completely stopped. No, 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 just a little longer, just a little longer. At this time, the old man was extremely anxious. His body shone brightly, and he searched in all directions, trying to find the flowing light that had originally disappeared from the depths of the void. However, it was a pity that the flowing light appeared under the control of Luo Fan, and was not born from the surrounding void. Under such circumstances, it was obviously impossible to find the flowing light again by searching in all directions. Just a little bit more. After a long time, the old man smiled bitterly and stopped. He was so close to breaking through the shackles of the sixth tribulation expert and becoming a seventh tribulation expert. As long as the flowing light and the cultivation mystery continued for a little longer, not too much time, just a few breaths, he would be able to completely break through the bottleneck, step into the seventh tribulation expert, and obtain the qualification to ascend to the seventh level of the Town Master's Road at any time. Unfortunately, no matter how much he begged, no matter how much he wanted to leave behind the mysteries of cultivation and the flowing light and the mysteries of cultivation completely ignored him and disappeared without a trace. Don't you think that if I can break through, the publicity effect will be 100 times better? The old man cried helplessly at the sky. No one was a fool, and Luo Fan's arrangement did not conceal anything. As long as a sixth tribulation expert thought about it, he would be able to understand the current ranking and the purpose of these rewards. They understood that these were all to attract more sixth tribulation experts to explore the heaven and earth phantom. Since it was for publicity, if a sixth tribulation expert broke through after getting the benefits, the publicity effect would obviously be 100 times better than sixth tribulation expert who got the rewards and was only one step away from breaking through. After all, you were only one step away from breaking through. Who knew that the limit of your benefits was only this step? In contrast, there was no need to consider the limits of the benefits if people directly broke through. Unfortunately, the old man's words did not arouse any response from the people around him, as if he was just talking to himself. At this time, many six tribulation experts felt an inexplicable force appear. Their bodies began to be gradually sent out of the void by this force. The whole process was almost absolute. Even if many six tribulation experts tried their best to prevent this force from sending them out, they could not change the fate of being sent out. At the same time, they also felt that the shielding effect that had disappeared in the void was also added to their bodies. In this process, the connection between them and their bodies was gradually covered up again. When they completely disappeared from the ranking space, the shielding effect had completely returned to its original state. They could no longer sense the existence of their bodies, and their bodies could no longer determine their situation. Facing such a situation, those six tribulation experts could not help but feel displeased. At this time, the ranking space in their minds also changed. The entire ranking space was completely cleared, and the countdown on the ranking space began to count down from tens of millions of years. Clearly, the next competition had already begun. Those six tribulation experts were slightly moved. Most of them threw all distracting thoughts aside and began to use all kinds of methods to promote the heaven and earth phantom they were in to undergo a drastic change. How to deal with the heaven and earth phantom was up to their bodies. To him, obtaining the reward for being ranked first on the leaderboard was his biggest mission. The small number of six tribulation experts also quickly figured out the main point. They also threw aside their displeasure towards the creator of the heaven and earth phantom and began to toss and turn. For a time, the six tribulation experts in the heaven and earth phantom became many times more active than before. The number of changes they caused in the heaven and earth phantom was also many times more than before. Among them, the most active one was naturally the sage-like old man. Compared to the other six tribulation experts who could only watch the benefits of being first on the ranking space phantom, he had personally experienced how great the benefits were. As for him, he only needed a little more time before he could completely break through. If he were to get first on the ranking space phantom again, no matter how much time was left, he would definitely be able to break through. Under such circumstances, he naturally had a stronger desire to be ranked first than any other six tribulation powerhouse. If it was before, this old man did not have much of an advantage in the competition with the other six tribulation experts. After all, be it in terms of cultivation realm or knowledge, there was not much difference between them. There were even countless six tribulation experts stronger than him. But now, after receiving the reward, the situation was obviously completely different. Currently, his cultivation realm had practically surpassed all the six tribulation experts in the illusory world of laws. Coupled with his previous experiences in the heaven and earth phantom, his understanding of the heaven and earth phantom was far stronger than the other six tribulation experts. With such an advantage, he had a considerable advantage over the other six tribulation experts in terms of the ability to cause the heaven and earth phantom to change. As a result, his name quickly appeared in the first place on the new ranking list. Moreover, the number of heaven and earth phantom changes behind his name continued to rise at an unimaginable speed. This situation made many six tribulation experts feel an extreme sense of urgency. The number of heaven and earth phantom changes on the ranking list also began to rise at an unimaginable speed. Before long, the number of heaven and earth phantom changes had already surpassed the number of heaven and earth phantom changes on the ranking list before the countdown ended. Seems like the effect is not bad. At this moment, in the core of the heaven and earth phantom, Luo Fan's incarnation showed a faint smile on his face. Luo Fan's many incarnations shared the same consciousness. Whatever this incarnation thought of, the other incarnations would definitely be able to think of. Whatever this incarnation thought was the most effective method, the other incarnations would also think the same way. Therefore, at this time, almost all the heaven and earth phantom had such a reward mechanism. Because of such a reward mechanism, the six tribulation experts in the many heaven and earth phantom also had an earth-shaking change. All the six tribulation experts became more than 100 times more active than before. At the same time, In various places of the sixth level of the Tao Master's Road, the incarnations of the six tribulation experts began to split up and quickly headed towards the heaven and earth phantom on each level. If Luo Fan's incarnation had the intention to investigate these six tribulation experts, he would definitely find that they were all six tribulation experts that he was very familiar with. Every sixth tribulation expert could be found in the heaven and earth phantom in a certain level of the nothingness ocean. Among them, almost every sixth tribulation expert's incarnation had to be counted in the tens of thousands. Many incarnations, almost like a river, quickly rushed towards the heaven and earth phantom. These incarnation rivers began to gradually divide as they approached the heaven and earth phantom. Like tributaries from the river, they gradually divided into the layers of the nothingness ocean and flowed towards the heaven and earth phantom in the layers of the nothingness ocean. Among them, the largest incarnation river came from a sixth tribulation expert who looked like an old man with a sage-like appearance. In other words, it was the protective river divided by the sixth tribulation expert who obtained the first reward in the heaven and earth phantom in the layer of the nothingness ocean that had the most islands. The reason for this was obviously because compared to the other six tribulation experts, he, who had obtained the benefits once, was more eager and looked forward to the next reward in the heaven and earth phantom. Apart from him, although the other six tribulation experts' desire for the next reward was slightly weaker than his, they were still in the stage of extreme desire. Therefore, there were naturally quite a number of incarnations. As for why they divided their incarnations to go to the heaven and earth phantom in the other layers of the nothingness ocean, and not to the heaven and earth phantom in the layer of the nothingness ocean that had the most islands, it was needless to say. There were already so many six tribulation experts here, and if there were more, it would obviously increase the intensity of the competition here. In contrast, there were many other layers of the nothingness ocean that did not even have a single sixth tribulation expert. There, the intensity of the competition was so low that it was almost non-existent. Chapter 3068. With regard to the fact that they could obtain opportunities and benefits from the projection of the world of laws, the six tribulation powerhouses who were already in the projection naturally did not want more competitors to come. However, if a matter was known by a second person, it would no longer be a true secret. In particular, although many six tribulation powerhouses did mind the appearance of competitors, they also knew that there were too many targets to choose from. In a situation where the probability of competitors appearing in the same projection as themselves was not high, it was even more difficult to maintain this secret. After all, every six tribulation powerhouse had close companions and cultivators who were willing to share their greatest secrets with them. With so many targets to choose from, they naturally would not be stingy with their companions. Naturally, they would know that there was a great opportunity in the projection of the world of laws. And these cultivators who were told about this secret also had such close companions. In this way, companions would inform companions, and in the end, this secret would no longer be a secret. Therefore, after the incarnation rivers appeared, smaller incarnation rivers began to appear in the other heavens one after another, heading towards the projection of the world of laws in the many layers of nothingness. The reason why the incarnation rivers were relatively small was naturally because although they trusted their sources of information, they had not seen the existence of the great opportunity with their own eyes after all. Therefore, they were naturally not as determined as those six tribulation powerhouses who had seen it with their own eyes to venture into the projection of the world of laws. Their actions, however, gave the other six tribulation powerhouses the best example. So many six tribulation powerhouses began to split their incarnations and enter the numerous projections of the world of laws at the same time. What would the six tribulation powerhouses think when they saw this? Obviously, even if they did not know what kind of opportunity there was, they would definitely be able to guess that entering it would definitely bring them some kind of benefit. Only in this way could the actions of entering the projection of the world of laws become so chaotic. Therefore, after this, Many six tribulation powerhouses who did not have any sources of information also began to split their incarnations and enter the projection of the world of laws in the layers of nothingness. Of course, they didn't have a source of information after all. They only acted because they saw the actions of many other six tribulation experts. Therefore, the actions of these six tribulation experts were less determined than those who had sources of information before. In other words, the number of clones that they had divided into the world of laws was much less than the number of six tribulation powerhouses. Even though there were at least a few clones that had entered different laws, even the largest number of clones would only be a few hundred. It was completely incomparable to the tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of incarnations of six tribulation experts. From a certain point of view, Luo Fan's promotion of the rankings had obviously produced an unimaginable effect. In this case, it should be able to greatly reduce the time I have to spend on this kind of cultivation, thought Luo Fan, who was in his own heavens. As the main body, he was naturally in control of the overall situation and had a grasp of the situation of the illusory figures of the world of laws in the many layers of the void ocean. He was even more clear about the changes that were happening to the illusory figures of the world of laws that could be said to be spread all over the countless layers of the void ocean, as if everything was happening in his heart. Originally, most of the world of laws in the countless layers of nothingness did not have any six tribulation powerhouses in her. After all, there were just too many of them in the void ocean layer. Even if the projection of the world of laws appeared in almost every layer of the void ocean, it was still impossible for the projection of the world of laws in every layer of the void ocean to attract some six tribulation powerhouses into it. Only a few of them would happen to have six tribulation experts in the void ocean layer and be interested in it. Thus, they would enter it. However, after Luo Fan released the rankings, the situation had clearly changed drastically. For those six tribulation powerhouses who knew about the rankings, the fewer cultivators that chose the world of laws, the higher their chances of obtaining rewards. Therefore, it was needless to say what kind of criteria they would use when choosing the heaven and earth phantoms to enter. After a period of time, the clones of six tribulation powerhouses had already entered most of the world of laws in the nothingness. However, it was a pity that their wishful thinking was clearly not going to work. It must be known that the current rankings weren't released by some artificial intelligence program, but by Luo Fan's clones. If there was only one six tribulation powerhouse in the world of laws, he naturally wouldn't directly rank that six tribulation powerhouse first without a sufficient number of six tribulation experts. This ranking would never be activated. As a result, those six tribulation experts who entered a certain world by themselves saw a few words shining with red light on the ranking list that appeared out of nowhere in their minds. Insufficient number of participants unable to open the ranking list. This change made those six tribulation powerhouses who originally thought that they would definitely obtain rewards feel as if a bucket of cold water had been poured over their heads. All their expectations turned into bubbles. There's a limit to the number of participants. They were filled with grief and indignation. If they had known that there was a limit, they wouldn't have specifically chosen this unpopular world of laws that no powerhouses could enter. Unfortunately, it was obviously too late for regrets. There was no doubt that this world of nothingness had a limit on six tribulation powerhouses. It was easy for them to enter, but it was difficult for them to leave. Therefore, in the face of this limit, they could only hope that other six tribulation powerhouses would also choose the world of laws that they were in. Naturally, some of these expectations were met with success, while others were disappointed. There were simply too many world of laws in this world of nothingness. If one were to really calculate, the number could even reach an infinite number. With so many world of laws in this world of nothingness, those six tribulation powerhouses who didn't know that the activation of the rankings required a minimum number of participants would naturally try their best to enter the world of laws that no one else had chosen. Therefore, if those six tribulation powerhouses wanted to wait for other six tribulation powerhouses to enter the world of laws that they had entered, they would obviously have to wait until their entry was forgotten by those who came later. Or They would have to wait until all the world of laws in the world of laws and the world of laws and the world of laws had already been entered by 6 tribulation powerhouses. Or some 6 tribulation powerhouses who knew about the limit just happened to choose the world of laws that they were in. Obviously, these 3 conditions couldn't be met in a short period of time. In this case, it was obviously impossible for them to wait for other 6 tribulation powerhouses to arrive in such a short period of time. In fact, the first 2 conditions were actually just for show. With the memory of 6 tribulation powerhouses, it was unlikely for them to forget even things that happened billions of years ago. How could they easily forget that they had entered that world of laws? Therefore, the possibility of waiting for other 6 tribulation powerhouses to forget that they had entered that world of laws was obviously not high. Secondly, the number of world of laws in this world of nothingness was almost infinite. No matter how many world of laws were used, as long as they continued to explore deeper, they would be able to find new world of laws. In this case, waiting for the world of laws to run out of world of laws, waiting for later 6 tribulation powerhouses to run out of new world of laws that no one else had entered was obviously almost impossible. Only the third possibility was more realistic. Although it would take a long time for these 6 tribulation powerhouses who entered the world of laws to spread the news of their problems, there were simply too many world of laws. Who could guarantee that there would be a world of laws that just happened to experience the process from insufficient number of world of laws to just enough number of world of laws? In such a world of laws, the 6 tribulation powerhouses in the world of laws would naturally know that there was a minimum number of world of laws that could be activated. In this case, once the countdown for the world of laws was over and they could contact their real bodies, this secret would naturally be made public and known to many other cultivators. Once the cultivators knew about this, they would naturally consciously choose to enter the world of laws that already had 6 tribulation powerhouses but had yet to activate the world of laws. Therefore, compared to the 3 possibilities, the third one had a higher possibility of being realized. Just as the number of 6 tribulation powerhouses in the world of laws kept increasing, on the other side, in the world of laws layer with the most islands, the island constructed by Luo Fan's incarnation was still increasing its presence. However, this increase in presence made it less attractive to the other 6 tribulation powerhouses. The 6 tribulation powerhouses that gathered here did not leave, but the speed at which new 6 tribulation powerhouses arrived began to rapidly slow down. After all, although the situation on this island was mysterious and had exploration value, it was still a completely unfamiliar island after all. Compared to the heaven and earth phantasm that could obviously bring him benefits, this place was no longer as attractive as before. As for the 6 tribulation powerhouses here, it was even simpler. After all, the ones here were only the incarnations or clones of those 6 tribulation powerhouses. When these incarnations or clones were first separated, their purpose was to explore this island. In this way, unless their real bodies directly assigned them a new mission, their mission would only be to explore this island. Everything else, even the exploration of the world of laws, which was obviously of great benefit to them, had nothing to do with them anymore. Even if their real bodies were interested, they would not be summoned back directly. It was obviously much simpler to change the mission given to them when they were first separated and create new incarnations to explore the world of laws. In any case, for existences at the level of 6 tribulation powerhouses, creating hundreds of millions of incarnations was just an ordinary method. Whether they had one more incarnation or one less incarnation made no difference to them at all. Compared to the trouble of summoning back their incarnations, the other 6 tribulation powerhouses who did not split out their incarnations to explore this island were obviously different. At this time, their attention was already attracted by the world of laws, which was more important and could bring them more benefits. As for exploring this island, they naturally no longer had much eagerness to do so. Without this kind of eagerness, it was naturally impossible for them to specially split out their incarnations to explore this island in this location. At the very least, this was the case for most 6 tribulation powerhouses. Because of this, the increase in the number of six tribulation powerhouses around the island naturally began to slow down. Although there were still a few six tribulation powerhouses coming from all directions from time to time, the number was far less than at the beginning. At this moment, in the depths of this island, in a certain layer of the world, Luo Fan's incarnation was watching the actions of the many six tribulation powerhouses on this island with bright eyes. In fact, he was quite surprised by the changes on the island. Originally, when those six tribulation powerhouses entered this island, he was already in a bad mood and wanted to drive them out. However, he did not expect that after just a slight pause, he discovered that the entry of those six tribulation powerhouses did not cause the problems he expected at all. On the contrary, it actually had a very positive effect on the evolution of this island. First of all, the problem that he expected the six tribulation powerhouses to cause when they entered this island was that their entry would destroy the original nature and harmony of this island. After all, the reason why this island could become so natural and have a stronger sense of existence than other islands was because the seventh tribulation powerhouse, who looked like a middle-aged woman, disappeared from this island, completely freeing the island from all external influences. Because of this, he very naturally thought that the addition of foreign cultivators to this island was a kind of destruction to the nature and harmony of this island. Naturally, he would want to drive them out. However, the development of the matter surprised him. Although in the beginning, the addition of those foreign six tribulation powerhouses did indeed have a certain impact on the nature and harmony of this island, this impact very quickly disappeared. Chapter 3069. After crossing that faintly discernible boundary, the island seemed to have lost all its stability, and its tolerance actually reached a level that even Luo Fan couldn't imagine. Due to this tolerance, the speed at which the six tribulation powerhouses were accepted by the island was actually only a few breaths. In other words, in just a few breaths, the six tribulation powerhouses that entered the island were directly accepted by the island. Everything that they did was naturally treated as the island's natural evolution. In this way, the influence that the six tribulation powerhouses caused on the island's harmony and nature naturally disappeared. On the contrary, because of their participation, the island's evolution actually advanced by a large margin. Just like the first layer of the world, although it was originally improving bit by bit, without the help of the six tribulation powerhouses, the first layer of the world would need at least billions of reincarnations to evolve into a world. Even if the time flow in the first layer of the world was extremely fast, the amount of time needed for so many reincarnations couldn't be short. Under such circumstances, it could be said that the efforts of these six tribulation powerhouses had already reduced the time wasted by the billions of cycles of life and death on this island, allowing the first layer to evolve and sublimate much earlier than it should have. It was precisely because of the impact of the six tribulation powerhouses' participation that Luo Fan gave up after thinking about it. He allowed the cultivators to do as they pleased on the island, and allowed the six tribulation powerhouses to enter the island continuously. At this moment, in the first level of the world, or rather, in the first level of the world, the many six tribulation powerhouses looked at the newly born world and felt their minds become incomparably open. Their originally depressed mood suddenly relaxed a lot. Although the world had transformed into a world, in reality, to ordinary living beings, this change in the world wasn't much. The entire world's geography wasn't much different from when it was still a world. The only difference was that the stability of space and time had a huge difference. The world's endurance towards the Exian realm and the alternate space, which had originally been close to its limit, directly became inexplicably empty. It gave people the feeling that the current world was still empty and could still withstand countless times more Exian realms and alternate spaces than the current world. Along with this change, the overwhelming feeling that filled the entire world naturally disappeared. It was also because this feeling of being unable to bear the burden disappeared that the senses of many six tribulation powerhouses changed like this. What will happen next? A six tribulation powerhouse asked his companion. Who knows? However, I think there will be a drastic change. For a world The current structure is really a bit clumsy, his companion, who was also a sixth tribulation powerhouse, said calmly. This world was evolved from their combined efforts. In the process of evolution, although they could not control all the details of the world, they could only transform the world into the embryonic form of the world, and then let it grow naturally according to the embryonic form into the current world. However, in reality, this embryonic form of the world was ultimately created by their combined efforts, and that embryonic form determined the current nirvana of the world. Back then, in order to reduce the chaos in the world, they had deliberately set the geography of this world to be the nirvana of the previous world. That was why after this world had transformed, it still maintained the same geography as when it was still a world. However, this kind of setting clearly didn't meet the needs of the world itself. In terms of the world, these various geographical and spatial forms could be said to be perfect. They developed and used the world's potential to the limit. However, if all these things were placed on the world, it would clearly be extremely unbalanced. For example, if you evenly distributed all the mass on this ball and allowed this ball to achieve absolute balance, it could naturally be said to be almost perfect with this ball. However, if the sphere was just the head of a certain creature and all the mass of the creature was evenly distributed to the sphere, then it would not be perfect. Instead, it would make the creature's head heavy and its feet light, making it extremely unbalanced. Clearly, in the previous world, it was like a ball. And now, the world was like that creature's head that was like a ball. In the past, the current geographical and spatial structure could be said to be almost perfect. However, in the present, it already made the world seem top-heavy and extremely unbalanced. Obviously, this kind of imbalance was naturally not allowed by the world. Therefore, once all the restrictions were released, when the world could adjust itself, this kind of phenomenon would naturally quickly change. And that time would soon arrive. In fact, from the moment the world began to transform, there had already been some sixth tribulation powerhouses who stepped into this island from the outside and appeared in this world. However, because the flow of time in this world was not much different from when it was still a world, the frequency of them entering was stretched to the point where only one or two would appear every tens of thousands of years. The impact on the entire world was almost negligible. At the very least, it couldn't change the original plan of the many six tribulation powerhouses here. Just like at this moment, there were only 3 six tribulation powerhouses who didn't participate in the original plan that appeared in this world. The 3 six tribulation powerhouses gathered together and looked at the world and the actions of the many six tribulation powerhouses with a look of amazement. They didn't participate in the plans of the other 6 tribulation powerhouses and didn't take the initiative to contribute much to the evolution of the first world. However, at the same time, they didn't destroy the plans of the 6 tribulation powerhouses either. They just watched coldly from the sidelines and watched as the world became more and more perfect. What's the point of them doing this? This is just an island opened up by a cultivator. Did they discover that doing this can give them any benefits? The 3 six tribulation powerhouses didn't experience the many 6 tribulation powerhouses on this island, so their mentality naturally couldn't be the same as the other 6 tribulation powerhouses. They couldn't understand what they were thinking about painstakingly helping this world evolve into a world. Perhaps they've discovered something we haven't. The other 6 tribulation powerhouse, who was also a newcomer, said with uncertainty. Of course, he was just saying that. He just watched coldly from the sidelines and didn't go up to participate. The other 6 tribulation powerhouse nodded solemnly and didn't say anything. He seemed to agree with the other two's judgment. Just as they watched coldly from the sidelines and the other 6 tribulation powerhouses were secretly anticipating, this world started to undergo an earth-shattering change. Earth-shattering rumbles rang out from an unknown place in the world, as if they were seeping out from the void. They continuously squeezed into this world and started to reverberate throughout the world. Following this change, it was as if an invisible giant hand had appeared in the world. It started to grab the alternate spaces, Exian realms, and even the cities and territories occupied by the main body of the world. It pulled them all into the depths of the world's space-time and forcefully pressed them down. During this process, all the living beings that were born and raised in this part of the world were horrified. Among them, the more powerful the living beings were, the more shocked they were. The range that ordinary living beings could sense was very small. They could only sense everything that was happening within several meters of themselves. Under such circumstances, this drastic change in the world was nothing more than a sudden earthquake to them. Moreover, it was a powerful earthquake. Under such circumstances, the only thing they were shocked by was the fact that the earthquakes were endless. It was as if something was grabbing onto the ground and was constantly breaking it. However, it was a different story for the truly powerful creatures. The more powerful they were, the greater the range of their senses, and the more things they could see. Naturally, they knew that this drastic change was not limited to a city or a pond, nor was it limited to a village or a town. Instead, it affected the entire world, or rather, the entire world. In this way, they naturally understood exactly how great the impact of this change was. Naturally, the more powerful they were, the more shocked they were. However, this drastic change did not last for too long. Very quickly, it stopped. When the drastic change stopped, at a glance, the entire world had become empty. The geographical shape that was inherited from that world had been completely overturned. The entire world became extremely barren. Mountains were razed to the ground. Plains turned into deep pits, and cities, villages, and even civilizations were completely removed along with all traces of civilization. Apart from being slightly barren, this world did not seem much different from any world that was created out of thin air, at least on the surface. As time passed, this barren world was quickly made up for by vitality. After all, this was the beginning of the world. The transformation mechanism that made the world metamorphose into a world had not completely disappeared. At this moment, there were still endless transformation mechanisms at work on the surface of the world. At this moment, when a large amount of matter and vitality in the world was sent into the depths of space-time, the transformation mechanism would naturally readjust and make up for the loss of the matter and vitality that had disappeared. Therefore, vegetation began to grow in the places where the matter and civilizations had disappeared at a visible rate. Before long, the feeling of desolation in the entire world had completely disappeared. The barren feeling became boundless and primitive. When one looked again, it was no different from when the world had just been formed. In contrast, in the depths of space-time, there were countless excion realms and alternate spaces. They were like the stars in the universe, decorating the depths of space-time and making it extraordinarily lively. Of course, even if it was lively, it was only relative to the original emptiness. In reality, even if there were billions of excion realms and alternate spaces, the depths of space-time were still extremely empty. There were still many places that could accommodate billions of times more excion realms and alternate spaces. Evidently, it was because this place was too empty that this world had naturally evolved and adjusted, placing a large number of excion realms and alternate spaces here. In fact, even if the alternate space and the realm of joy were placed here, they would still not be able to fill the void and restore balance to the world. That was why the world directly transformed the civilizations, countries, cities, and villages on the surface of the world into realm of joy, forcefully moving them into the depths of space-time to fill the void. It was precisely because of this that everything developed like before. This caused the surface of the entire world to become like the nirvana from before. At this moment, all the six tribulation powerhouses fell into silence. Although this was a world that they could casually destroy if they wanted to, the changes in this world still made them feel as if they had comprehended something. Before this, they had never felt the instincts of the world so clearly. They had never felt the spirituality of the world as clearly as they did now. In the past, even if they knew that the world had instincts, had some kind of subtle spirituality, and even had the will of the world. However, at the very most, they could only sense the existence of the nascent soul and the others through the evolution of the world over a long period of time. Even though they were six tribulation experts, They had never truly felt them or faced them head-on. After all, they were not Luo Fan. They did not have the opportunity to come into contact with the will of the world again and again. It could be said that they had cultivated for billions of years. Today, at this moment, was the first time they truly felt the spirituality of the world, the instincts of the world. This sensation had broadened their horizons. They felt as if their understanding of heaven and earth had been deepened in an instant. It was to the extent that their notions about the heavens and the earth began to undergo some subtle changes involuntarily, as if they had become more complete and complete. Just this harvest alone is worth the trip. At this moment, this thought flashed through the minds of countless Six Tribulation experts. Mobile reading access.